Good morning. This is chapter one, APUS history. We are going to go through the first chapter of our lecture entitled New World Beginnings. So I will try to make this under 50 minutes, no more than 50 minutes, as it would be a regular lecture for one chapter. So we have the beginning of American history, and we have to talk about the beginning, really, like 33,000 BC, according to this text, even before Columbus and Native Americans were there. So we need to talk about a few of that geographically and then culturally, sociologically of the people coming in. Now, chapter one contains these areas where we can call sections in this area here. So we have this section of chapter one, the shaping of North America. Geographically, if you know the shaping of North America, this is how North America looks like. We got to understand its geography. So the way it is believed that it was formed was there. This was all covered in ice, and then there was this ice bridge, which was able to get people from Asia, particularly Siberia, Asia, to travel to get people to travel from Asia to North America. Because of this frozen ice bridge before it melted, many people from Asia was able to arrive in North America. Now, people didn't just sprout out of the ground and started to exist, just popped out of the ground in California, popped out of the ground in Florida. They all originated from a certain central point, as far as historically, archaeologically recorded. And that actually boils down all the way down to Mesopotamia. But as far as North America is concerned, because this is US history, we have to talk about that. The migration came from Asia, and then these Asians moved into North America, settled there. Naturally, they would become the Native Americans. The Native Americans. Of course, there's all kinds that eventually will be culturally developed, having their own culture. But this is what they're trying to explain here. So they just name some geographic terms. The Appalachian Mountains is on the east side, right here, eastern part. You have the Cascade Mountains, the Sierra Nevada Mountains on the west, and also you have the Rocky Mountains right here on the middle. These are the types of mountains that existed at this time. Also, you have the Canadian Shield. It says a zone undergirded by ancient rock, probably the first part of what became the North American landmass to have emerged above sea level. This is the Canadian Shield, Canada. Around here, they believe that this emerged first on top. Okay, so all of these ice eventually melted, and now you have beneath it the topsoil sprouting up. Okay, and then you have a huge melting of water of ice coming down to the middle part of America, which kind of explains why the middle part of North America is flat, and you have the Great Plains being formed. Okay, next section is peopling the Americas. Peopling the Americas. So people came from Asia with this arrow here, as you can see, coming in, and they started to move to warmer places. And this happened thousands of years ago, 10,000 years ago. These were these Asians, nomadic Asian hunters coming in. Now, the Asians were nomadic people, meaning they weren't farming. They didn't practice or even realize that you could even do that. They weren't practicing farming. They would eat whatever they could in their environment, in the bushes, the animals roaming around, and then move on to another place. That would be a nomadic kind of group. But today, of course, we don't go around eating and eating everything off. We practice something called agriculture, where we plant. You could actually replant and stay in the same place without having to worry about running out, because you would just take the seeds and replant the rice, the grain of wheat, or even the corn. Okay, so there was already societies doing this even way before the Europeans came in. Columbus comes in 1492. There were already 54 million people living in North and Central America, and they already have their own society names. Incas in Peru, Mayans in Central America, the Aztecs in Mexico. So they had this societies already in existence even before the Asians and Europeans would have come in and claimed to have discovered it. The Europeans believe that, oh, we discovered it, and that's actually kind of contradictory. This idea of discovering, no one really knows the first person to discover. Actually, they just didn't know each other existed. Yeah. So there were already people living there. Okay. So what were these earliest Americans in the third section here? The earliest Americans were basically their form of agriculture was corn. So you can see that the nomadic way started to slowly change, and they started to realize it's better to plant instead of having to eat everything. So they realized you can plant corn, and corn was their main form of grain. As you know, there's wheat, there's grain of wheat, there's grain of corn, there's grain of rice. North America, the Native Americans there were living based on corn. And they started to spread out. When corn was being developed agriculturally, then it became possible for more societies to grow in population big populations. Okay. Of course, it was also mixed. There was still at the same time hunting and gathering and also agriculture. So you can put those two, together in these societies. Of course, Mississippi was the one that was really mixed with agricultural societies here. There were already trading. Another form of trade is trading corn, which is another form. The name of it is maize, Maize. They were already forming that. And they also have the Pueblo peoples living in the southwest part. They were already irrigating the desert. They have all of these complex civilization, even the Aztec Empire, which was from Mexico to North America. It was big. Even the mound builders in Ohio Valley, the Mississippian culture in the lower Midwest, the Anasazi people in the Southwest, the Cahokia in present day St. Louis. There were all these people. A lot of them had this common trait to become mound builders. As you can see here, there was this kind of mound that they were building. And that was a very typical way to identify their culture. Again, they had a belief that the higher you are, the closer they are to their gods, their deity that they believed in. And so they had temples and religious centers with high mountains. All right. Okay, so here we have names of the geographic locations of North America and also the types of culture that existed. We say cultures almost like saying nations, Native American nations and tribes, but we can just say cultures, complex cultures. So you can see there's the Northeast, Southeast region, Southwest, Great Plains, very flat, the Great Basin, Plateau, the Northwest Coast, and California, Southwest Coast in a sense. This is the regions, and there's all kinds of Native Americans living at that time. They're not all the same. There's the Sioux Indians, for example. There's the Cheyenne. There's the Pueblo Indians, Comanche. Even some of these are named after what vehicles, right? Cherokee. Uh, some we kept even till today. Alabama, Illinois, Iowa. We kept their names. Famous ones that we know in history: Iroquois, Powhatan. So there's so many of these tribes that already existed at that time. Okay, so the one way that they really populated the area was something called three sister farming, which had corn growing and beans growing around the corn stalks, and then squash covering the ground of the corn to help retain moisture. So they call this three sister farming: beans, corn, and squash growing all together. When they had this kind of practice in their farms, the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee people, for example, were able to grow so much in population. Not only were they growing much in population, they were also creating a kind of government, the Iroquois Confederacy, politically and militarily organized. The Iroquois band together to organize themselves. The kind of culture that they had was matrilineal, meaning that the possessions passed through the female line, unlike in European, the firstborn of the son would receive it. That's called patrilineal, but this is matrilineal. So the mothers would receive that inheritance. And how did they believe? Generally, they revere the physical world was filled with spiritual properties. So they would believe in some sort of worship of a god in the rocks, in the trees, or spirits living among the nature. That's their spiritual belief. So, 1492 was the day where it was they first encountered Europeans. The European continent encountered the North American continent, and then you would have a lot of kind of bad things that would happen because of the diseases that came into an immunity level that was so weak in the Native American people. Okay, so this is entitled Indirect Discoveries of the New World. Now, we tend to think that Columbus is always him. He's always the guy. It was Columbus, and that is not true. The first Europeans, as so far as we know, there were the Scandinavian or Viking Europeans. So, about 1000 AD, almost 1,000 years ago, there was the Vikings who were going and who went to that area by first going to the edges of England, which is northwest of Europe, and then from that point on, going to Greenland, then going to Iceland, and then going to Canada. That's how they would try to travel to North America, and then they have evidence of the Vikings going there, and then they died in that region. Of course, they weren't planning to colonize; they were just looking for trading and all that stuff and things that they could, rob from in a sense. So that happened in as far as Newfoundland. Okay. Um, Now there was this urge to trade more with the wider world, meaning in England, in Europe, in China, there was this urge to become economically powerful. And how that could happen is through trade. Now, the Europeans knew that at that time, about 1200 AD, the Chinese were very rich, very powerful because of the trading system, the trading network that they had. Europeans weren't really trading as, in a sense, become powerful, but then they realized that they would have to. But now that as they're expanding and they realized how there was so much riches in Asia. They said, we have to really trade with the Asians. We have to find a way to get to Asia. So the Christian Crusaders, for example, who had to go down to Jerusalem in that point of history to have a war with the Muslims, as they were going down there, they saw how the Chinese had, wow, the Chinese goods were all over the place. Silk clothing, they had medicine, they had perfume, they had draperies, and even the Muslims had carpets. There were spices from Indonesia, sugar, and Europe was missing out. Europe had no network. So they were thinking, how can we get the luxuries of the East into Europe? Okay. So they realized they have to be inventive. So Europeans start to expand beyond Europe and they start to enter Africa. Marco Polo also wrote a book when he went to China, when he was there for about 20 years. He explained how China was so advanced with golden pagodas. And so because of that, they started to go to Africa to test how far they can go. They went to West Africa, but there was an issue. It was their ships. The ships couldn't go into deep waters because as you can tell, if a ship goes into deeper waters, what would happen with that ship is waters would obviously come inside the ship and then the ship would sink. So you would have to build a bigger hull in the ship. You would need to build a bigger hull in the ship so that the water wouldn't come in. And then they realized that they would have to do that. Also, a higher ship, a sail with a very high mast, a sail meaning like, the SAIL, the kind of like that blanket where the wind catches. If they could build that high, then the wind could catch it and they could help propel or push the ship forward. So they had to create a new ship. They realized that they had to be scientific, mathematical, inventive, innovative in order to do that. And so when that was finally developed, they could even travel around Africa. They could go as far as not just West Africa, because you can imagine the continent of Europe and Africa, the way they're situated. They would first travel down the West Coast and go all the way. And then they realized they ought to go all the way around. Now, when they were trading with Africa, they realized that they can get gold from Africa and also they can get slaves. So this was an economic benefit: gold and slaves, slaves for the labor and gold for the money. Okay, so you can see how that was the plan. And they had a system that they realized that they could do in order to become rich. And this system was the sugar plantation system. They would get slaves and transfer them to an area where they could be forced into labor, in this case, to plant sugar. So they built in the islands, coastal islands of Madeira, Canary, San Tome, and Principe, where they built these islands, plantation in these islands. And they carried 40,000 slaves into those islands, and they forced the slaves to become working in the plantation system. So this is also the beginning of the slave trade by the Portuguese. Eventually, they were going to travel further than Africa around this area and move into Asia. So you can see in black and in light blue, Diaz and Vasco da Gama were from Portugal, seeing if they could reach China. The goal was to reach Asia. Even if you reach India, at least India would be a home base to trade with China. Now, why couldn't the Europeans travel this way? It's because they had the Muslims in the way and they had wars against them during the Crusades. So a safer route without having to be robbed or going through the dangers of the Muslim tribes, they went this way. In order to do it this way, they had to invent better sails. So who were these guys? Bartholomew Diaz was the one that went around this Cape of Good Horn. Okay. And then you have Vasco da Gama, who was the one that reached India. All right. And these are the Portuguese navigators who went this far. But the nation that would really take advantage and grow powerfully was Spain. Now, how did Spain grow powerful? So Spain had to consolidate itself. Before it was even called Spain, that area here in this peninsula, this Iberian Peninsula, there was many kingdoms, and the two big ones were Castile and Aragon. And the king and the queen got married. So Ferdinand of Aragon got married with Isabella of Castile, and then they combined their kingdoms together, and then they kicked out the Muslims who were invading, and the Muslims wanted to take over all Europe, but the Spanish were able to kick out the Muslims back into North Africa. So the Muslims tried to come here, and they kicked them back down. Because of this, they felt that they were very powerful. Now with this power that grew from this new consolidation of this new kingdom of Spain, they had this urge and thirst to even expand themselves. Then this came Columbus. So in Spain, a modern national state was taking shape with unity, wealth, and power to shoulder the formidable task of discovery, conquest, and colonization. Columbus is Irish from Italy, but Spain was the only one to pay Columbus that could fund Columbus's expedition to look for a new route into Asia. They had to look for a new route into China or India, and they paid Columbus to look for that route. Now, Columbus had a hunch. Columbus said, I think the world is circular, that if I travel west of Europe, I will naturally meet China or India. But As far as that time, no one was able to dare to travel that far. There was a lot of superstitions that they would fall at the edge of the world. But Columbus was the one who believed to do it. So Christopher Columbus in 1492, funded by the Spanish Empire, was able to start this crew. So they left on 1492. And finally, on October 12th, 1492, they saw an island, and it was the Bahamas. Now, Columbus had a big misunderstanding. He thought that this was Asia. But obviously, when you travel west of Europe, you're going to see the North and South American continent in the way, right? And they didn't know that that existed. So naturally, Columbus said, these are the Indians of India. But of course, they weren't the Indians of India. They were the Native Americans of the Bahamas. The Bahamas is in the Caribbean, and the Caribbean is in North America. That's why we say when he discovered the Bahamas of North America, we also say that he, for all the Europeans at that time, he discovered the North American continent for the Europeans who didn't know yet. And he called them mistakenly the Indians when they weren't Indian. But that name kind of stuck. Of course, it's more proper to say Native Americans. Now, now that they have this new discovered opportunity in Central, North, South America, this meant that they could have this new growth. Europe provided the markets, the capital, and the technology. Africa provided the labor, the slaves. And the New World offered raw materials, precious metals, and soil for cultivation of sugarcane. So when you have this combination of Africa, Europe, and America combined, you are going to have a new kind of market system created. We can call this the Columbian trade, especially. So this collision of worlds, when worlds collide, two ecosystems, they're finally going to be introduced for the first time in a sense. What do you mean these ecosystems are going to be introduced? For example, there's only types of animals that stayed in North America for thousands of years. Vice versa, only these types of animals stayed in Europe, Asia, and Africa for many thousands of years. But now, for the first time, the animals and the plants can now switch sides or be planted in another region, in another continent. And some people will be introduced to these animals for the very first time. For example, in the New World, plants such as tobacco, corn, beans, and tomatoes only grew in the New World, even the potato. But now they transferred those plants and now they're being planted in Europe. Potatoes were doing so well in Ireland, for example, for a point that people just depended on potato. They were eating potato for the first time in Europe. And also vice versa. Like the Europeans were able to bring in some stuff from Europe into the native world, Native America, North America. Horses was introduced, cattle was introduced, pigs were introduced to North America. They were seeing horses for the very first time. They were eating steak for the very first time in America. So this is what we call the Columbian exchange. Christopher Columbus introduced a new exchange of goods. All right. Also, there's this sugar revolution. Now, sugar was so tempting in a diet. Sugar needed to be in everything. They wanted to get labor to grow that sugar. So they used the Africans as labor to work on these sugarcane fields. And they would crystallize the sugar or melt the sugar and then dry it and then make sugar powder for sale. Okay. Now, not only these goods are being transported like sugar, whatever, also diseases were being transferred. Yes. So a lot of Native Americans died because the Europeans' diseases were so bad, and the Native Americans were, in a way, so pure in immunity that once this new disease was introduced to the Native Americans, thousands and millions of them died. That was the main reason the population decreased. 90% of Native Americans died because of diseases. Of course, there's war too, but that's like a small segment. It was really the diseases. So let's look at this graph here, and you can see this exchange of gold and silver, New World. When we say the New World and Old World, we're talking about New World, the Americas, and the Old World, Europe, China, and or Asia and Africa. So what was being exchanged back and forth? Of course, New World, they took their gold and silver, corn, potatoes, pineapples, tomatoes, tobacco, beans, vanilla, chocolate, diseases like syphilis. What did the Old World give? Wheat, sugar, rice, coffee, horses, cow, pigs, smallpox, measles, bubonic plague, influenza, typhus, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and of course from Africa, slave labor. This was now being exchanged at the introduction of Columbus's arrival. So now we're going to get focused on the Spanish at this point. So which European nation started to colonize first in North America? It's really the Spanish first, and then the English later, but the Spanish in Central and North America, mainly in Central America. So we can imagine how it would be Spain next, because Spain is very powerful. But of course, Portugal, in a way, was also discovering places too. So you're going to have this natural conflict. Portugal discovered, or for themselves, wanted to colonize Brazil, today's Brazil, which is South America, while the Spanish landed and wanted to colonize today's Mexico, Central America. Now, eventually, as they would expand more and more in the Americas, you would see a conflict brewing. You would have Portugal and Spain eventually go into conflict because they want to take that land. So the Pope steps in and says, we need to share America. I know this is kind of weird and strange and unfair. They think they have a right to take America, although there were Native Americans already living there. So wouldn't it be the Native Americans' land? But in any case, the Treaty of Tordesillas was a division of North America or the Americas by drawing a line from north to south of America and then sharing or dividing the land from the west would be Spanish land and the east of that line would be Portugal land. Now, pretty much the east side only contained Brazil, today's Brazil. If you can see the map of the Americas, you can kind of see that Brazil is shifted on the right side. I'm just gonna show that to you in another picture. And then the rest of the land, like America, North America, shifted on, most of it is on the west side. So Spain made a deal that you take the east, which is Brazil, and I'll take everything else, which is the rest of it. They didn't know that there was more land that Spain would get as they soon discovered westward. Okay. Okay, so that's the Treaty of Tordesillas that was drawn as a line by the Pope. Now that the margins were settled, it's now time to conquer it. So the Spanish sent these soldiers called conquistadors who would travel into Central America and start claiming that land. So there's these conquistadors, in a sense, like generals, like Vasco Nunez Balboa or Ferdinand Magellan. All these Spanish conquerors would go and try to take something for them for Spain. Of course, they really wanted to look for gold. Vasco Nunez Balboa was hailed as the discoverer of the Pacific Ocean. Yeah, I know, right? Like he discovered the Pacific Ocean. You know, China had been there. People in the Philippines or in Micronesia knew that there was a Pacific Ocean, but they didn't know that the Atlantic Ocean could be right next to the Pacific Ocean. And when you think about it, you think of that central part of America, that little tiny peninsula here. This is all Atlantic Ocean, and this is all Pacific Ocean. And all Balboa did was went here and be like, hey, there's a new ocean, and hey, there's a 1 mile behind me, there's another ocean. So I discovered this Pacific Ocean, and then this Atlantic Ocean is behind me. Very strange how they would believe it that way, although people knew that these oceans existed. Magellan, very famous. He started off from Spain. He went to Guam, and then he also went to the Philippines and claimed discovery. But eventually, he would die in the Philippines. But his team, the other ships, his expedition team, would be the first in European history to navigate the globe or to go around in full circle. That would be Magellan. And Juan Ponce de Leon, another conquistador, would discover Florida. Would name it, Florida, land of flowers. Francisco Coronado would discover Arizona, New Mexico, and go as far as Kansas. So these guys are already trying to claim all of these territories for Spain. Okay. Hernando de Soto, okay, he would continue down to Mississippi River and Arkansas. Francisco Pizarro would be in South America, today's Peru. And actually, he was pretty big deal because Francisco Pizarro, South America, found a lot of silver. And when he found all that silver can be used as a currency, gold and silver, right? But silver was the main thing in South America. So he took all that silver, brought it into Europe, made a lot of money. Money was even more injected into the currency into Europe. So Spanish was getting more powerful because of this. All of these things that they were finding, right? And there was also the islands of the Caribbean, like Jamaica, the Bahamas, for example, all those places. Those areas served as offshore bases for the Spanish. So the Spanish would be having those naval bases, in a sense, in those islands, and then they would go into America back and forth. Okay, but in those Caribbean places, they practiced the encomienda system, forcing the Native Americans to labor. Now, this is a very controversial thing. What right would these Spanish believe that they have authority to tell the Native Americans to become slaves? What right? Unfortunately, they used religion as an excuse to have authority over the slaves. They abused the concept of religion, in this case, Christianity. They said, because of Christianity, because we're going to give you Christianity, this form of Christianity, which is at that time Catholicism, we're going to give you this form of Christianity because we're giving it to you, you should become our slave, right? We have to give you our religion because our religion is better than yours, whatever the Native Americans are worshiping. That's why, as a thanks, you should become our slaves. So many Native Americans were used as slaves in the name of Catholicism, especially Catholic. Of course, today's Catholics, they don't do that. Many people in Guam are Catholic, but in all factuality, in history, and in truth, these nations use Catholicism to make many people say, this is not unknown to us. We all know stories of like Two Lovers Point, for example, or the chiefs being forced to be baptized, or Mary the Spanish. All this is very, they all did it in the name of Catholicism. Of course, Catholics don't do that today, but in history, it's true. Yeah. So that form of Christianity was leading into that slavery. But there were some priests who knew that was wrong, like Bartholomew de las Casas, who wanted to defend the Native Americans from that kind of oppression. But of course, the rulers of Spain, the leaders of Spain, the military might of Spain didn't listen to these priests. Okay, Hernando Cortez now. He gets his own section because he's the one that's going to make a big conquest of Mexico City, where it's like the capital of the Aztec nation right here. This area would be kind of like the home base of Spain. Of course, there are already other conquistadors trying to conquer and establish these places, looking for gold, really. We talked about them already, but it's in this direction. They had a base in Cuba, and then they set the stage to go into Mexico City. Okay. In order for them to conquer, there's not a lot of people, right, compared to the Native Americans who were already there. So it required some sort of deception by the Spanish. How could the Native Americans, the Aztecs of Mexico today, Tenochtitlan, how could they have not defended themselves from merely a small group of Spanish people? How come their numbers are bigger by 1,000, 10,000 Native Americans surrendered to about, 400 to 800 people, less than 1,000 Spanish people. So what was the plan that Hernando Cortez had, the Spanish had, for him to do that? First, they had to get a translator. And the Aztecs of Mexico, also there was, besides the Aztecs, there was the Mayans and the Huadl. There were different kinds of tribes around that area. And they took one Indian slave, one Native American named Malinche. Malinche became a translator. Now, how do you get a translator? First, they just take one Indian and they teach Spanish words to the Native American. They teach Spanish, and then she learns Spanish, right? And she naturally became the translator to translate to the Aztec rulers. So Malinche eventually learned Spanish and was baptized, I guess, joined the Catholic religion. Her name changed to Doña Marina. Okay. Now, of course, the translator, Malinche, and Native Americans told Hernando Cortez that, hey, our enemy, the Aztecs, they have a lot of gold that you're looking for in the capital of Tenochtitlan. A lot of gold. And there's a chief, a king there named Montezuma. He lives there. So there is 300,000 people living there. And they had about 400 Spanish people who are going to take it over. All right. Now, the reason why they were able to do it is because you have to know the Aztecs had a superstitious belief. The Aztecs have been waiting for their Messiah, this god called Quetzalcoatl. And they believe that the god would return from the Eastern Sea. This god would return. This god would be riding on a dragon. And the dragon had fire coming out of its mouth. And we're just waiting for that second coming. So the Aztecs believed in that religion, right? And this Quetzalcoatl god will be coming in a great array of light, so bright. So that's what was in the Aztecs' mind, and religiously they were thinking about that. So then what happened was, finally, when they arrived, everyone bowed down to the Spanish. Strangely, the Spanish were like, "Why is everyone bowing down? What's going on?" And then they knew that the natives, the Aztecs, mistaken the Spanish Europeans as the gods who have returned. Now, how is that possible? Remember, they were supposed to be riding on a dragon, but they're riding on a horse. Of course, a horse is not a dragon, but remember, the Native Americans have never seen a horse before because horses only existed in the Asian, European, African continent. But in America, they were never seen a horse. So it was a big impression, a big deal. Also, they were wearing armor. So they thought the god was the god of light. Armor was shining from the sun. Also, they thought these were the gods shooting fire. Because the guns, they've never seen a gun before, and that was shooting fire. It was very powerful guns. They naturally believed that this was the god that was supposed to return. Now, the Spanish are greedy, right? They're looking for gold and power. So they said, yep, that's us. We are the gods. And so they started to take all the gold that was there. And they said, we need the gold. This is what the request is. But the Aztecs were getting suspicious because they looked very pathetic. They were hungry for that gold. And one Aztec wrote it like this. They thirsted mightily for gold. They stuffed it They stuffed themselves with it. They starved for it. They lusted for it like pigs, one Aztec. Now, eventually, the Aztecs realized these guys are not gods. They're just regular men. European Spanish people are just regular men. And then the Spanish knew that they were beginning to realize that, so the Spanish attacked first. They laid siege to the city, surrounded the city. Now, but still, there was 300,000 of them, right? You could think that, whoa, you could simply destroy those Spanish. But there was one thing they couldn't overcome, and that was the disease. A lot of the Native Americans, the Aztecs, were sick because of the diseases that they encountered from the Europeans. So they were weak already to begin with. So the Spanish laid siege, destroyed, with the help of the smallpox epidemic in Mexico, and they took down all the temples and replaced them with Catholic cathedrals in the cities. And so he brought all of these crops and his animals, Hernando Cortez did, and the religion, and changed Mexico. In order to control them, he mixed the culture in by intermarrying. If they could find a way to control them, then they found a way to do it like this. Why don't they intermarry the Native Americans with the Spanish people? So they married in the women. So now you have these mixed breeds of Spanish and Native Americans, and that's how they would control the people more because now they're blood related. It's hard to go against their own blood. Okay, so Spain spread everywhere besides Mexico, going into Peru, and then starting to plant their culture, the Spanish culture, planting their colleges, the Spanish education, and all that stuff. So that's the spread of the Spanish. Now, just so you know, the English were starting to realize that, wow, there's some opportunity in England. And we'll talk about that in the next chapter. So we can see that they were sending Italians and English people into North America already and kind of probing and checking out the place in the Canadian area. But the Spanish were there earlier, so they're establishing themselves, colonizing themselves earlier in that region. The Spanish erected a fortress in St. Augustine, Florida, so they're already starting there. Now, you would think of the Native Americans. How about in other places besides the Aztecs, the Tenochtitlan? Yes, the other places were trying to be colonized, like in Southwest America, which is today's New Mexico, that area. They had a battle led by Don Juan Oñate. The Spaniards cruelly abused the Pueblo people, and the battle was called the Battle of Acoma, okay, in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Um, the Spanish overcame them and won, and then the Southwest had to surrender. So there were times when Native Americans attempted to rebel against them. It wasn't easy to do. You call that Pope's rebellion. Okay. Um, what would trigger it? It was the Catholics who would force them to become Catholic, right? So the Catholic missionaries would say, hey, your religion is evil, it's witchcraft, it's sorcery. Of course, the Native Americans, to them, that's their religion. They don't see it as the devil and the sorcery. They think it's really true to themselves, to their belief. And when these Catholics come in, they accuse them of witchcraft or being a bad religion. So of course they're going to take that wrongly. So they would have that, those witchcraft, or they'll be punished, accused of being witchcraft, and to them they were like innocent, and so they would remember those things and they would form a whole platoon against the Catholics. All right, and so there were so many of these Pueblo uprisings, and the Catholics had to hide in their fortresses. Of course, they would get help later and take back their empire from the Pueblos in the southwest part of America. Also on the west side in California, there was Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo exploring the California coast, and even Father Juniper Sierra founded at San Diego 21 missionary forts. So California had 21 missionary forts. Okay, and we can see that eventually at another area, but in California, you would see 21 forts, and they would name it after every saint. So, for example, San Diego. Then you move up, you got Santa Monica, Saint Monica, Saint Obispo. Move up, you got San Francisco, Santa Cruz, and so forth. So you get the concept how the Spanish gave those cities names. Even Los Angeles is not a Native American name. Los Angeles means the city of angels. So you can see all of these Spanish names naming it after all of their own saints. 21 missionary forts would be placed on the west coast. Okay. And of course, it'll be starting at San Diego. And their goal of these missionary forts were to convert the Native Americans into Catholicism. Okay. Okay, so they also erected a colossal empire sprawling from California to Florida, Tierra to Del Fuego. They grafted their culture, laws, religion, and language into all these Native American societies. They forced all of them to speak Spanish. So the Spanish really put on such a strong culture upon them. And the Spanish paid the Native Americans The high compliment of fusing with them through marriage and incorporating indigenous culture to their own, rather than shunning and eventually isolating the Indians as their English adversaries would do. So the Spanish, that's how they controlled them. That was their style. Intermingle with them, force labor upon them, and make them Spanish. Try to make these Native Americans Spanish. Okay, so we can see in this map around 14, starting at 1492 up into 1743, about 243 years, 200 plus years. This is how it changed. Once it was ruled by their Native Americans until the Europeans came. In green, the Spanish took this part. And this line right here, this dotted line, is the Treaty of Tordesillas that we talked about to divide the east, which is a small portion, to the Portuguese, and the west, the rest of it would be Spanish. So you can see that the Portuguese got the bad half of the deal. The bigger land was actually here, but they didn't know there was much land yet. So this is what the Treaty of Tordesillas did. And once that happened, then the conquerors started coming in, especially Hernando Cortez taking this point. Okay, so this is what this is about. Okay, so at the end of every chapter, you see this chronological order. When you just look at this one more time at the end, then you can realize the order of things happening. Okay, starting from 1492, Columbus comes in, a bunch of explorers claiming this here and that, having little rebellions here and there. Pizarro crushes Incas. Um, Coronado exploring the Southwest. The Native Americans getting stronger because they had to defend their land, and missions being founded up into 1769. So this would conclude chapter one lecture. So you would listen to this to be able to answer the quizzes or to understand something more about the chapter. Well, that's it. All right. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on which time you're watching this. This is AP Chapter 2, APUSH Chapter 2, the planting of English America. Last time we've studied about how the Spanish started coming into North America through Christopher Columbus and other conquistadors, Spanish conquerors started to colonize and establish themselves with and putting in slavery there. This happened mostly in Central America, today's Mexico. But we know that in U.S. history, the English were the ones that ended up establishing themselves in North America in the end, or till present day. So we want to know more of the English history, right? That's obviously what U.S. history falls mainly under, is a branch of. They were descendants of the English before they called themselves Americans. And so we have the planting of English America, the beginning of this colonization in America. We have to know that the background of this situation. So we call this the context. We will learn the context. We will learn what was going on that eventually led to the colonization of England. Just so you know that in Europe, everyone was already competing for power. In order to become powerful, they would have to establish colonization because of the resources, gold, and raw materials that they can pull out from the Americas and bring them back to their European nation so they can sell it, manufacture it to make products, and so forth. The Spanish were already establishing themselves in North America and Central America, the French already, and then Jamestown of England. England is going to establish their first colony there. But let's understand the backdrop with this. Section one, England's imperial stirrings. So what this means is we need to understand that religion played a big role. And at this time, they already had the Protestant Reformation. England was a Protestant nation by that time. There was half of Europe was Protestant and the other half was Catholic. So because of this, there was a lot of laws. There was no freedom of religion, so to speak. If one country said all of you have to be Catholic or all of you have to be Protestant, that was law. Some nations like England allowed Catholics to be there; they weren't in trouble. But sometimes in France or in Spain, they said if you were a Protestant, get out of the country. They would even persecute them if they were not Catholic. So if they were Protestants, they would get in trouble for that. But the Spanish Catholics, the Spanish Catholicism, it was actually pretty strong about keeping its goal that everyone in Europe should become Catholic. So this had a lot of issues with England because England became like the figurehead, the representative of Protestant Protestantism, and Spain became the figurehead of Spanish Catholicism. Right. So now Queen Elizabeth comes into the fray. Now, because the Spanish were already an enemy to England because of their religion, there was a few things that Elizabeth didn't stop the pirates from doing. So there were English pirates already, and these English pirates would steal Spanish treasure from ships. Of course, the Spanish were already stealing it from the Native Americans and trying to transport it over. And while that's happening, the English pirates will steal it from the Spanish. So there was this underlying conflict already. They knew that there was this tension between each other. English is making the excuse that, well, I can't stop the pirates. That's they're all there in the Caribbean beyond our control. But the Spanish wanted them to do something about these pirates because it's attacking their shipping. In any case, the English attempted to establish a colony, but it failed. And this was near Newfoundland, and this was also in today's North Carolina, in Roanoke Island. They were trying to establish themselves. Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Sir Walter Raleigh were trying to do that. However, it didn't work, and the people just were not found. A lot of them were speculated that they were attacked by Native Americans and stuff like that, and so that one failed. So Spain and England were eventually going to head into a clash. Now we want to answer the question: how did Spain descend and lose their power, and England reign and gain power to eventually get almost all of North America, as you know today, right? Including Canada. How it happened? How come the Spanish? Well, what was it that lost that made them lose their rights to that land or whatever? There was a war. This war is going to switch off the power, and this is a war in which Spain and England had a war because of the Spanish attempted to assassinate Elizabeth. It failed, but they found out that the Spanish was trying to get Queen Mary of Scotland, who's a Catholic, to take over Queen Elizabeth. So they planned to assassinate Queen Elizabeth. They worked with Queen Mary of Scotland. And if Queen Elizabeth dies, then Queen Mary will become queen and she will make England Catholic again. But they found that out. They investigated it. They knew that, the Spanish were behind this. Instead, Queen Mary of Scotland becomes beheaded. She gets beheaded and she dies. It becomes a reason, a pretext, a justification for the Spanish to go to war with England. The Spanish were saying, "You killed our beloved future Catholic Queen of Scotland." So anyway, they went to war. But in this war, it looked like the Spanish were going to win. They had this so-called invincible armada. They built huge ships. And finally, when they had a showdown, the English were actually very poor and the ships were small. But actually, that was an advantage because the ships were so heavy. It took a long time to turn. It took a long time to escape some attack. English ships were smaller and it was quicker. So when the wind came, a strong wind, which came in with the direction of the Protestants, it helped them to destroy the English ships because the ships were too heavy. The Spanish ships, the English ships destroyed the Spanish ships with the help of the wind. They call that the Protestant wind, very famous. So this war ended with a treaty, and this treaty basically said, North America, that will be English territory. Spanish won't touch it. We will give up that right to go there. We won't touch it. We lost the war. Do not mess with England. And then England said, you just stay down there in Central America. Today's Mexico. That's where you'll establish your colonies. So this becomes the reason for England's naval dominance in the North Atlantic. Okay. And at the same time, other things were happening within the Spanish Empire. The other territories and colonies the Spanish were establishing started to get independence. Really, they started to the Spanish colonies started to rebel. They didn't like it, so the Spanish had a lot of things to work on at this time, and this led to the descending power of the Spanish, and the ascending power of the English. Okay, so now it resulted to a strong, unified national state under a popular monarch, a measure of religious unity after a protracted struggle between Protestants and Catholics, and a vibrant sense of nationalism and national destiny. Now, this is highlighted in orange. This is very important. When a country is divided between Protestants and Catholics and whatever, what to do, it's hard to move on in that country. There's other things they have to work on within themselves. But when England rose to power, everyone respected that power. Everyone loved being an Englishman. Everyone said, we can do greater things. So Protestants and Catholics in England began to work together with a sense of nationalism for the sake of their own nation. And they believed that they could even establish themselves outside of England. So when England and Spain finally signed a treaty of peace in 1604, the English people were poised to plunge headlong into the planting of their own colonial empire in the New World. So now that their enemies are taken care of, there's no one to bother them. Now all they could think about is growing their power. Okay, next section, England on the eve of empire. Suddenly there was an economic depression. This means a lot of people were unemployed. If there's a depression, the jobs start closing down because no factory, no companies making profit. They have to let go of the workers. So that means thousands of footloose people, farmers, are just wandering around. We call this a surplus population, right? Now, what happens when there's a lot of people roaming around and there's nothing to do? They need to move out of England, okay? And you're gonna understand how there's a lot of people who wouldn't want to stay in England anymore. They're gonna move out of England. At the same time, there was these laws like primogeniture. Primogeniture is when the eldest son would inherit the land. So that means if you were the second, third, fourth, fifth, whatever born son, you wouldn't get the inheritance from your father. That was only a right given to the firstborn son. This is an English practice. So when all the firstborn sons took all the lands, all the estates, where can the second, third, fourth, fifth sons go? They also are looking outside of England. We need to get land outside, right? At the same time, I joined stock company. Now, this is important to understand investment. It'll be hard to explain it here online, but let me try my best. Okay. When a company starts, it needs money. So it borrows money from the people called investors. In this case, they're called inventors. So if you loan your money, if a regular person says, okay, this Virginia company, I'm going to give money to you, you pay me back when you make profit. That's the deal of a joint stock company. That's how even today's companies work. You loan them money and you could be part ownership. So when you give them money, they say, okay, you have a share in our company. We are sharing the ownership with you because you put in some money. And that share is like a percentage. The more money you put, the bigger percentage of your share of your profit. So you call this style the joint stock companies. This is the beginning of corporations. Basically, a company doesn't have enough a lot of money, so it needs to borrow from someone, some people, and those people are the investors. They expect to be paid back with a higher percentage. Okay, so these three conditions: population growth, the unemployment, religious freedom, were all enough to get people out of England to look for a place in North America. Joint stock companies provided the financial means. Now they had the money to do it. So this orange is important. This is one way to conclude an answer. It was these three things. Okay. Now, the first place, Jamestown. Jamestown. And the company that's going to be having money to do it is the Virginia Company of London. So the main attraction for going to North America was gold, just like how they saw the Spanish get gold from Tenochtitlan, and they were jealous of that. Ah, there has to be gold somewhere in North America. So a lot of people were investing. Okay, we'll give you some of my money, some of my money. Hope you find gold. And they only intended that the joint stock company that is going to go to Virginia only for a few years, and then when you make a profit, you're going to pull out of North America and live back in England. But they never expected to live long term in Jamestown. Of course, they never expected to become the United States of America at that point. They just thought this is a temporary place to make money. So a lot of Englishmen said, okay, I have no job. There's a lot of people roaming around. I will participate in the Virginia Company. I'll be one of the sailors. I'll be one of the colonizers. So that's why you had a lot of people at that time willing to go there. And they said that if you move there, your right as settlers will be the same thing. You'll be protected. The same law will apply to you, right? Because you think, well, we're moving to another land. Who's going to protect me? Which law? Then they said the same laws in the English Constitution will also be brought to America. Okay, so they set sail at 1606 and they landed May 24th, 1607. The first established Jamestown colony was in 1607. Established meaning it's not going to fade away, it's going to continue. So, Jamestown, Virginia is the first English colony. Right? You guys probably know that. About 100 English settlers. They called the place Jamestown. 40 would be 40 would be colonists perished during the initial voyage. Some of them were being shipwrecked. So there's a lot of hazards, danger when you move. Okay. You get sick on the way. You even get sick when you land there. Your body's not used to it. There's a lot of, you have to have food ready. You finish all the food in the ship. What are you going to eat? Now, there was a problem. When people moved there, finally landed in this new place, and they're going to start to call the place Jamestown and clear out the forest and start getting the wood and whatever. They weren't trying to sustain themselves. They weren't trying to start to farm. They were wasting their time digging for gold, looking under the forest, looking behind the trees, whatever. There were no gold. There was no gold, and they were just gathering. They weren't even gathering berries or whatever. So many people started to die until John Smith comes in. So this is when John Smith has become more strict. He comes in and says, "Hey, you guys stop looking for gold." And he pulls out a verse: "He who shall not work shall not eat." That's in First Thessalonians, right? If you don't work, you won't eat. Or Second Thessalonians. And so you have to start working for food, farming, blah blah blah. Stop looking for gold. Okay. But the English people knew they need to get help from the Native Americans. Obviously, there was Native Americans already living there, the Powhatan people,
were there. There was this Powhatan chief, kind of like a king, and had a daughter, kind of like a princess, Pocahontas. So John Smith was actually captured by them, and Pocahontas saved John Smith's life by saying, "Please do not kill this guy, this John Smith." And so, because of this, there was a temporary peace between the Native Americans, the Powhatan tribe, and the English, and that's how they got food back and forth. However, still wasn't enough. When eventually, when winter comes, that is when people start starving. Winter is coming, right? And they were eating dogs, cats, rats, and mice. 400 settlers who were there starved to death when winter came, and 60 remained alive. Wow, that's a lot. 400 to 60. The chances of survival are 10% in a sense. So that happened. It's wintertime, so it wasn't easy to survive. Okay. And then another military guy comes in besides John Smith, Lord Delaware. He ordered settlers back into Jamestown. People were about to leave Jamestown. He says, no, his style was military, strong discipline. And if Native Americans mess with you, we're going to fight against the Native Americans. So later, 15 years later, Jamestown improved. We started to have 1,000 people. So this is growing now. Now, as they're growing, the population is growing, right? So you have the states or the land to being taking going into the English, and that land is being taken away from the Indians. So as they expand, it's good. It seems like they're expanding larger and larger, but while they expand, they're taking away land that formerly belonged to the Indians, or the Indians felt it was a threat. They see this is growing. These English colonists, they're growing their fort. That means eventually our land will be taken away. So the chief said, we have to form a Powhatan Confederacy. We got to ask other Native Americans to help us out. So this increased the tensions. So basically, because of this tension, and because of the English also getting desperate, there were there were some Englishmen were even stealing from the farms, from the Indian farms. So this was a natural reason to have the Indians retaliate. So they had the first Anglo-Powhatan War, and Lord Delaware, the captain, he was ruthless. He burned Indian houses, he confiscated provisions, he torched the cornfields. So this was a big war. So, but what stopped the war? The marriage between John Rolfe and Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan. Now, what's the big deal about John Rolfe? This is this is significant because this is the first interracial union in Virginia. The first interracial, another race marrying another race, happened here. Okay, so this was only a temporary peace, but eventually they had a second Anglo-Powhatan War. Anglo is like Anglo-Saxon, right? English Powhatan War. Yeah, they tried to make peace again. Okay, so the Powhatans were going in through this misfortune. The Powhatans weren't becoming successful or something, but there was these. You can say these are the three Ds: disease or disorganization and disposability. Right here. What happened to the Native Americans? Sadly, the Powhatans were the first tribe to be in contact with diseases. Now, the English people had diseases too, but their immune level was higher because their genetics are different than the Native Americans. The Europeans had a history of diseases that their body has already been accustomed to, builds up an immunity level, and the immunity level also gets passed down to their children. But if you can imagine the Native Americans who has never experienced these diseases, because they're pretty much clean people, right? But then in Europe is very dirty, very dirty. The Native Americans are actually cleaner. So when they experienced these diseases from the English people, they got sick quickly and they died, especially with smallpox and everything like that. Okay. And also, disorganization. There were so many Native Americans. How come they couldn't fight back the English? They were disorganized. They were disorganized. They weren't united to have a good position to attack the English people. They were just not organized militarily. The Europeans are organized military. They're used to fighting. They're used to military tactics. And lastly, disposability. Disposability. Okay. The natives, as far as the Virginians were concerned, could be disposed of without harm to the colonial economy. Indeed, the Indian presence frustrated the colonists' desire for a local commodity the Europeans desperately wanted land. So, what do you mean disposability? Now, there's one way you can survive. The Native Americans could survive if they were trading with the English people, if they made a deal here and there. But the English people said we don't want anything to do with them. We don't want to trade with them. That's what it means by disposability. Okay. So let's talk about the Indians world just a bit. So the Indians new world was a shock. The Indians, when they first saw the Europeans, they were not used to it. It changed the way of life. For example, when the horses were introduced to North America, the Sioux people who were used to just living in a stationary place now moved to the open plains. Also, diseases changed their way of life. So because of diseases coming from the East Coast, coming from Virginia, everyone moved out of the East because they were afraid to catch the disease from the Europeans. And because of the disease killing so many people, sometimes these nations became small nations, small Native American tribes that they joined in other nations. Also, when guns were introduced, so this made certain tribes more powerful, and then they had more power in the trading system. And so they would use violence, use their guns that they got from the Europeans to threaten other Native Americans. So the introduction of guns changed their way of life too. And then Native Americans wanted dibs in this new economy. Now, what do you mean? New products came in, right, from Europe, which Native Americans had never seen before: guns, horses. And so it was like, who's going to be the tribe to make a deal with them? Whoever Native American tribe makes a deal, they'll become one of the most powerful Native American nations. So everyone's trying to get their place in this tribe. Okay, so there is also a new kind of region that was created called the Middle Ground. This middle ground is talking about the land between the Europeans and Native American. This began to be called the Middle Ground. No one wanted to live in the Middle Ground. That was only the Middle Ground, meaning just for trade. So it changed the geography. Okay, Virginia's main moneymaker, tobacco. So tobacco, uh, was was kind of a way to pass the time. It was like a lifestyle. Smoking tobacco, even though tobacco has no health benefits, rather it has the opposite of that, gives you lung cancer. But they didn't know that. So tobacco was just like drinking tea. People would smoke tobacco in their pipes, and then in order to have tobacco to sell tobacco, they had to get more land. So in North America, tobacco was the money maker. Okay, so if there's something that they can make money of, if they can't find gold in Virginia, then they're just going to use it to plant tobacco to sell it. So that was the profit of Virginia and the colonies at that time. The southern colonies, they wanted to use the land to grow their tobacco because they would sell it. Okay, so that was king nicotine, right? Now we say this as a symbol or a metaphor that this king is the one that's taking away the land from them. Okay. Um, also in 1619, there was a ship of 20 Africans. We can't really say they're slaves yet. It could be partial, but this is the beginning of African Americans arriving in the North American continent. It was a very small percent of the population, but that was the beginning of the arrival of African Americans in 1619. And also, the London Company authorized the settlers to summon an assembly known as the House of Burgesses. And this is the beginning of starting a type of government here. Now, when a company goes into Virginia, the Virginia Company goes into the New World, don't they need some sort of kind of government to to establish order? So they realize we have to create an assembly, a little group of people who are voted in to establish order, to enforce laws. So that is called the House of Burgesses. All right. Okay. Now eventually, the Virginia Company is going to be bankrupt, and this is going to change the power. First, it was the company that has power, the autonomy to do whatever they want, until they're bankrupt, and then it becomes a royal colony, meaning the king and queen or whatever the royal government has control over this colony, not the company anymore. Okay, so that was mainly about Virginia. Now, so we're halfway there. Now, this section is about other southern colonies that were now being established after Virginia. So as you can see, this is Maryland. So why was Maryland there? So Maryland was a land north of Virginia, and that was purchased by Lord Baltimore. Is a prominent English Catholic family. Now, the Catholics were being persecuted in England. So there's majority of the population is Protestant, and the minority are Catholics. But Lord Baltimore wanted to create a safe haven for these Catholics in North America, and Maryland was going to be the safe haven. So they would make a law saying that no one should persecute Catholics for their religion. So that's how Maryland was there. So that law is called the Act of Toleration, meaning that they will tolerate all kinds of religions. Unfortunately, they didn't tolerate Jews and atheists, but any other religion they could tolerate. So that law was the Act of Toleration in Maryland. Okay. And another part of English colonization that people tend to forget is the West Indies, which is today's Caribbean. Actually, there were more people, more English people moving to the Caribbean. Why? Because of the warm tropical climate, which is used to make sugar. So, for example, Jamaica was taken by the English. Sugarcane was a rich man's crop. They make a lot of money from sugar. That's where all the money is in. Actually, tobacco wasn't the main thing, even though tobacco is US history, right? But that's like a poor man's crop. You can't grow sugar in a colder place, so you go to grow tobacco. But sugar can grow in a warmer place. So if you want to make more money, people will be moving to the West Indies, moving to Jamaica to make a lot of money. And they would have a sugar mill like this to make the sugar. Okay. But in these tropical places, they imported a lot of slaves, African slaves, to work the sugar plantations. And they even copied this Barbados slave code, which is a very violent slave code, egregious, that slaves have no rights and masters have complete control over the slaves' lives. This is Barbados slave code. So they would beat, inflict vicious punishments on the slaves. So this is the beginning of the cruelty of how they start to treat African Americans. And this, because the slave code, first, this became a tradition, a bad tradition. And then this is the beginning of African Americans being mistreated as slaves. And then the slave code didn't only arrive in the Caribbean, they used that same code in the Carolinas in their slavery. So in Carolina, before it was called North and South, before they separated it, it was just called Carolina. Again, it was purchased, named after King Charles II. And Carolina was going to have a first, they had a lot of Savannah Indians that migrated out of the place. Indians were going to be used for the plantations. And this time, a new crop was rice. Rice was going to be Carolina's main crop. So that's where rice was going. Okay, so that's what it's known for. Carolina was the southernmost colony before Georgia. Okay, Georgia is going to be the last colony, then the bottom. Florida is not part of the United States at this time. That's under Spain. But Carolina is going to be the bottom. And so if the Spanish have Florida and if Carolina is near the Spanish colony of Florida, there's a lot of Anglo-Spanish wars because remember they are enemies. So this region, Carolina had a lot of tension with the Spanish in the south. Okay, now North Carolina emerges out of the Carolinas. Why? Is because North Carolina is different than South Carolina geographically because the economy, geographically because their land, because the best land was in South Carolina, so all the rich farmers got there. North Carolina was mountainous, so it was hard to have large land, so it was in pieces. So the lower class people, in a sense, moved to North Carolina, small farmers and stuff like that. So they called North Carolina a place for squatters. And the big land gentry or the high class people stayed in South Carolina. So they decided to just create a state called colony called North Carolina, and South Carolina separated from each other. Okay. So actually, North Carolina was very independent minded than South Carolina. Okay. Um, so they say that the way they think is like a democratic way of thinking, aristocratic. They were against aristocratic, meaning high class people. Even Rhode Island was like that. Okay. And now the last colony, Georgia. Georgia was the last colony to be established. As you can see, 1733. Remember, Jamestown was 1607, right? Look how many years, 133 years later, 125 years later, Georgia was now established because of the um, colony of the Spanish in Florida. They had to create a buffer colony, kind of like a border, so that they could put soldiers to protect the English colonies from the southern invasions of the Indians and the Spanish. So that's the reason why Georgia was there. So Georgia was kind of like a fort, and the guy who founded it was James Oglethorpe. Okay, he was the one that's going to be a military leader establishing this kind of discipline here. Also, Georgia was known for many missionaries coming in to this region too, like the German Lutherans and also the Methodists. So, to summarize, we went over not only Jamestown, but all the southern colonies: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Those are five southern colonies. What they have in common is they became really agricultural economies, establishing tobacco and rice. Most of them were of the Church of England. Um, that's the kind of that's an Anglican church. So there's all kinds of Protestant churches. So the type that they were under, most people were Anglicans, Church of England. Here's a little section of the Iroquois like this. All right. So that was chapter 2. Hope you guys use this to study. This chapter again is the Southern Colony, the five Southern colonies. This is APUSH lecture chapter 3. Chapter 3 is about more of the northern colonies, including the middle colonies. So if you don't know, there's a reason why there are 13 stripes. There are 13 stripes in this American flag because it represents the 13 colonies. And we could divide those 13 colonies into three regions: north, middle, and south. All right, so those would represent these 13 colonies. Okay. Um, but this is about the north and the middle colonies mainly, right? So this is from the beginning of 1619 to 1700, just like last time we talked about the same periods, and it was the southern colonies. And now we're going to talk about the upper half of America, the northern half, which is the northern and middle colonies. Um, Now we got to talk about also the motivation for these colonies here. Okay, so you would need to know some background. So let me just try to work this. Just having problems trying to present this window. So in chapter 3, it's a lot of religion that we need to talk about here, just because it's the motivation and for these northern people to move to America. And we need to understand this Protestant Reformation. Now, you have to understand this European background because in about 1517, the Catholic Church began to change, actually changed a lot by adding all of these doctrines and everything else. And the Protestants, there were people within the Catholic Church who knew this was wrong, right? The Catholic Church got corrupted at that time. And what I mean by corrupted, for example, they were saying things that many priests felt that this is wrong. They were saying that you would have to pay your way to go to heaven, donate a lot of money, and when you hear the money falling into the basket, that means you're sealed in heaven. All of these things were just to get money and greed, and it made people very poor. And also, the Pope abused his power and took a lot of power. So there were some priests who knew that this was wrong. One of them was a German friar, Martin Luther. So he protested against this. He's saying this is wrong, and then the Pope felt that it's my word. God has given me the power and authority to decide these things. And Martin Luther said, no, the Bible is the authority. The word of God is the authority. The scripture is the authority. Um, and because of this, the Pope kicked out Martin Luther. And actually, the Pope even said, whoever kills Martin Luther does God's will. So a lot of the people were looking for Martin Luther, because he was going against the Catholic Church. Actually, Martin Luther was kidnapped by some knights, and they put him in a tower. In a way, kidnapped, but really to save him from being killed. And they put him in a tower, and that's when he translated the Bible from Latin to German. And this is a big deal because the Catholic Church only said priests are only allowed to have and read the Bible to explain the Bible. And anyway, it has to be in its old Latin language. And Martin Luther said, no, no, that's not right. I'm going to translate the Bible to a language that people could understand, which is German at that time, which was his language. And he wanted to show people, look, people, read the Bible and check for yourselves. Where does it say that the Pope has the authority, the Bible has the authority? This is the way to go to heaven by faith instead of doing all these works to go to heaven, because the Catholic Church, give a lot of requirements to go to heaven, a lot of sacraments. And Martin Luther was against that. He says, no, those sacraments are not the ways to go to heaven. And it's almost impossible for anyone to follow. But the Bible says, justified by faith in Jesus Christ alone. So because of that, Martin Luther wanted for people to see it themselves, to check themselves in the Bible that that's the way. So he translated it in a language they could understand. And then at the same time, the printing press, the Gutenberg press, was invented. And so they were able to massively print the Bibles in huge numbers. And it spread all over Europe. And that became the Protestant Reformation. Of course, these former Catholics, a lot of them got kicked out of the Catholic Church. A lot of them were smart and educated priests who knew that it was wrong. Actually, these priests wanted to fix the Catholic Church. Martin Luther wanted to fix it. Like, hey guys, I found a way to go to heaven properly, correctly, based on the Bible. Let's go change this. So we all could go to heaven together. But the priests, or the popes, didn't want that. They said, no, we've been doing it right. These doctrines are okay to do. And that's the reason why the Catholics call these guys who left the Catholic Church protesters. And of course, the name stuck. That's why you got the name Protestant Church. So a lot of this beginning of the Protestant movement was created by John Calvin was also one of them. Um, and also he was a big branch from the Protestant Church, and a lot of his doctrines, created the Presbyterian Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, and Calvinism became a kind of like a new theology um, in Protestants. He wrote a book. John Calvin wrote a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. Okay, and he wrote that God knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell. Church, Martin Luther wanted to fix it. Like, hey guys, I found a way to go to heaven properly, correctly, based on the Bible. Let's go change this. So we all could go to heaven together. But the priests or the popes didn't want that. They said, no, we've been doing it right. These doctrines are okay to do. And that's the reason why the Catholics call these guys who left the Catholic Church protesters. And of course, the name stuck. That's why you got the name Protestant Church. So a lot of this beginning of the Protestant movement was created by John Calvin was also one of them. Um, and also he was a big branch from the Protestant Church, and a lot of his doctrines, created the Presbyterian Church, the Dutch Reformed Church, and Calvinism became a kind of like a new theology um, in Protestants. He wrote a book. John Calvin wrote a book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion. Okay, and he wrote that God knew who was going to heaven and who was going to hell, and those who are going to heaven are what was called the elected. And in other words, it's the same, almost the same as predestined. So this theology of predestination and election was a big theological doctrine for the Protestant Church or the Calvinist people. So we have to understand that Protestants have a different belief in conversion than the Catholics do. So in Guam, a lot of people are Catholics, a dominant Catholic, right? So we don't really know Protestants or experience what they really, really believe in. But conversion is different. For Catholics, you're a baby, you're baptized into the church. That's your conversion point for Catholics. Whether you accept it or reject it, your parents, put you in this christening, right? And you're automatically part of the Catholic Church. But for Protestants, it's different. It's not like that. For Protestants, it is conversion happens at the moment you believe that Jesus Christ died for your sins and you had faith on that. That is the moment of conversion. So there needs to be a conversion point based on the belief. So, for example, conversion happened when they had an identifiable experience in which God revealed to the elect heavenly destiny. So there needs to be this experience, a conversion experience, an experience where they believed in Jesus Christ's sacrifice on the cross. This is what Martin Luther was getting at, John Calvin was getting at, that is the goal, that's the object of faith. Yeah, have faith, but have faith in what? When you have faith that Jesus Christ died for your sins, then that is the beginning of that is the conversion point. So what were they being converted from? Part of the theology of Protestants is that everyone was born a sinner. So because they're born as sinners, destined to go to hell, they have to convert by believing to change their destination, converting from a sinner to becoming saved, child of God, or whatever. So this is the theology, all right? And those who were converted, they had to show that their lives were changed. And this is kind of the big stretch. This is where it got really intense. And then you got the word Puritans coming in. So how can you tell who's saved and who's not, right? You could just to believe is such an invisible thing. Faith is invisible. So the way that they could show was their actions, visible saints. So they would have to show their holy behavior, sanctified behavior to prove that they were converted. So this became an extreme thing for the Protestant church because they had to show almost kind of like be perfect. And if they showed some imperfections, it'll be very difficult for them to be a church member. So the England church became a Protestant dominant church in England, not the Catholics. England was a Protestant church, but then even within the Church of England, there were people felt that it still wasn't pure enough. They still weren't perfectly separated from the old ways. So there was this group called the Separatists who says we should separate from the Church of England. Okay, so these guys who said the Church of England wasn't pure enough had to become more pure. Okay, so they got the name separatists, they got the name Puritans. Now the king didn't like that because the king was part of the Church of England. The king was the head of the Church of England. So in a sense, even though the Church of England is not a Catholic church, but in a sense, King James acted like there was like a pope, like he is the boss, and he said, "These so-called Puritans and separatists in my Church of England, you better get out of my church. You better get out of England." So now you can see, aha, I know what's happening here. These Puritans are going to end up in North America, in Massachusetts, in Plymouth Bay, basically, to start their own, thing. So this is where we're getting at. And so, because the Puritans were having trouble, they had to leave England. So they went to Holland. They were living in Holland for 12 years, but then their children were being Dutchified. Now, because their children were learning Dutch, the culture of Dutch, coming home, learning Dutch language and education, then the English culture is going away. So this Dutchification of their children, they felt they cannot live in Holland anymore. So from Holland, they said, we got to get out of here. Let's go to the New World. Let's go to where people are in America. And this time it was just Virginia. So they made a contract uh, with the Virginia company, and they said, okay, we will give money, and we want to, pay this ship, the Mayflower ship, and our goal is to go to Virginia. But instead, while they were traveling to Virginia, there was a wind, there was a storm that moved them up north, and they landed in Plymouth Rock. And that was in Massachusetts. Now you would think, okay, we should turn around because we had a contract and we already bought land in Virginia. That's where we should go. But the Puritans said, you know what? God created the storm. God has a reason for pushing us in this direction. We accept it. We obey it. We will stay here. And so they didn't go to Virginia. They just remained there. And that's how it ended up becoming in 1610 or 1609 or 1620. Or 16, when did they go here? 1608, 1610. This is, so they said, this is where we will stay. We will stay in the Plymouth colony. We will stay in this part, which is today's Massachusetts. And they had the Mayflower Compact signed. Now, they had no Virginia company watching over them. There was no government watching over them. So they had to quickly create a kind of temporary government, a kind of constitution. So who would be the boss? It's all of us. We'll have a vote. This is a first step of self-government. Okay. That it's going to be majority rules. Whatever the majority vote is of whatever rule or law, that is going to be the way we're going to form our government. So it's going to be based on majority rules. That's a concept of popular sovereignty in a sense, where the majority decision is going to be the law of the land, majority of the people. So that was all called the Mayflower Compact. Okay, but 1620. Okay, 1620 is when they started. Of course, it's always winter, right? Winter will really show if they'll survive or endure. So winter came. Only 44 out of 102 survived. So they knew they had to make a kind of treaty with the Native Americans, and so they had one, and it was their Thanksgiving Day. That's why we celebrate Thanksgiving. They had a good relationship with Indians at that time. Okay, so that is how they were starting. There was also a leader, William Bradford, who also helped establish them to focus on hard work. And so this was the kind of a Puritan beginning in a sense. They were able to outlast the winter because they weren't looking for gold. They started to work immediately, work the farms, work for each other's food, support each other like that. So what kind of government is this then? This became a Bible Commonwealth kind of government. It's a government under the Bible. That's what the Puritans wanted to do, to really try to be a city on a hill. That's a thing that John Winthrop called it, to be the city on a hill, to be a city, a town that's going to be an example for all the world to follow. So that's also a Bible verse, right? A city on a hill. When a city is on a hill, then all the world looks up to it. They can see it, and it becomes a role model. And that's what John Winthrop had an idea of what this new Plymouth colony would look like. But what's happening in England is that there was even greater persecution against Puritans. So more of them left England, and more of them went to either the West Indies or New England or Massachusetts here, Northeast. So eventually they had to create a company, right? So in order to be a legit colony, they had to have some company, some money making purpose, not just because of their faith. Otherwise, the king wouldn't accept it. So they formed a charter, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, just like they have the Virginia colony in Virginia. This is the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they were going to find a way to make money. It wasn't going to be tobacco. It was really going to be a lot of fishing and timber. But there was a lot of people migrating. We call this the Great Migration. A lot of it is because of the persecution of the Puritans, and also others because it was just so crowded there. Many Puritans had to choose between going to New England, where it's really cold, or go to the West Indies, where it's really warm, like Guam, like Trump, all that. So 40,000 of them went to the Caribbean, and then 20,000 went to New England, which is Massachusetts and others. So, um, their kind of economy was based on fur trading, fishing, and shipbuilding. Those are the mainly important industries to make money. Okay, fur trading, like for example, wearing fur was kind of a big thing, luxurious thing. So that was the fur trading industry, actually wearing beavers. Okay, so what kind of people would have a right to become part of the church? Now they believe that if you want to vote, you have to first condition is this: you have to be part of the Puritan church, the Puritan congregation. If you want to have a majority say part of a vote, you want to decide something, a law, if you want to have some right, you have to first be a church member. And so they had a lot of church members who had to be interrogated and check if they're really saved, really converted in their faith, and then they were going to be a free man. That's what we mean by free men. Adult males who belong to the Puritan congregations, they had the right to make decisions in many of these cases. So, um, so to be a church member is is what was the condition to decide something in the government. That's not democracy. Actually, they didn't want that kind of democracy. You know, they thought if they gave this right to vote to everyone, even non-church members, just random people, then you can have unsaved people, non-Puritan people deciding things for the Puritans. So they didn't want that. They didn't want that democracy. They wanted only church members will be making decisions. That's why it's called a Bible commonwealth. It's a commonwealth of people who follow the church. Church members only have this privilege, not everyone. So actually, the Puritans were against democracy. They said it was the meanest and worst of all forms of government. So let's not be confused about if the Puritans were like exactly democracy, not exactly. The church was still the head. Okay. But there were still some things they tried to make fair. The idea of separation of church and state. So a clergyman or a pastor could not at the same time be in a political position like governor, mayor, whatever. The clergyman had to focus on the church, and the mayor had to focus on the political matters. So they knew that they had to separate church and state. Protestant ethic. So there was a difference between the culture of the North and the South. So the New England people were different than the people in Virginia. They believed in hard work and separated themselves from worldly pursuit. Now, what this means in worldly pursuit is they separate themselves from like worldly things and they focus on the spiritual things. And what we mean by worldly, in a sense, is like sinful things of the world that they thought, like partying, drinking, and getting drunk, and all of these things. Um, they said, we don't have to waste time for this. We got to just work, work, work. And because of this Protestant ethic, they worked hard and their colony was established. They weren't trying to be greedy, looking for gold. They weren't trying to cause trouble, whatever. So that's why it was so organized. Okay. Eventually, Connecticut also became another Puritan colony because Plymouth was growing a lot. Okay. Now there was also some problems still. So this is trouble in the Bible Commonwealth. And there's two here. We'll talk about first is Anne Hutchinson. Anne Hutchinson and her children, her 14 children, were going to get kicked out. Why? It's because she claimed this. She claimed that a holy life was no sure sign of salvation, and that the truly saved need not bother to obey the law of either God or man. You call this antinomianism. Now, why is she getting in trouble for saying this? She's saying that you do not need to live a perfect holy life to prove that you are saved or converted or going to heaven. Okay? You don't have to have good behavior as a proof, as a condition. And you don't have to follow the law to go to heaven. Okay? And we can agree, like, okay, that's according to Puritan belief, that is correct. But her real trouble was this. I don't need, she says, to follow man. Now, she's basically saying the church, you don't need to go to church because that's where the man preaches, or that's where the laws or sermons are being taught. We don't need to do you need to do that. I could be at home, read the Bible on my own, interpret it on my own. I don't need to be under anyone's authority because that is her claim. So the church banished her. They felt like she doesn't want to go to church or really be any under authority. She doesn't want to follow the church ways. If the church makes a law, or if the congregation makes some law, she says, I'm free from that. So she got banned. And while she got banned, unfortunately, she died. There was Native Americans having a little battle, and then she got caught under it. So what do you think about her belief? Do you think she was correct? You don't need the church. You don't need anyone to teach you the law. You could just learn everything on your own. Just read the Bible. Well, that's Puritans felt that was wrong. Okay, now check this case out. Roger Williams, though. Roger Williams also got kicked out. And he got kicked out because of these two things here. He said that it is not right to take the land from the Indians without paying them. Now, remember, the English people just came in and they just settled there. And then they said that's their land. Okay. Now, is he right or wrong? Yeah, of course, he's right. You cannot just simply take land that's not yours. We felt, don't touch it. At least talk to the Indians, pay them something, give them whatever they want, and then make a deal. Okay. But he got in trouble for saying that because these Puritans were saying, no, God gave us this land. This is not supposed to be theirs. Okay. So Roger Williams was getting in trouble for saying something that he believed that, according to his conscience, was wrong. But in reality, the Puritans were wrong in this part. Okay. And again, the second one is this: he denied the authority of civil government to regulate religious behavior. Okay. He's saying that it is wrong for a government to regulate religious behavior. It is wrong for a government to force people to worship God, to force people to go to church. That is not right. So he's really talking about the freedom of worshiping, right? Church. So Puritans were forcing people. You have to go to church. You shouldn't work. Blah blah blah. But say no, that it's not true. It's not real. It's fake. It's like you don't really want to go to church. You're being forced by your own government. So he felt like, oh, that's also wrong. So these things, he challenged the Puritan church. Instead, he got kicked out. Okay. So what happened? Of course, again, just like Anne Hutchinson, well, it's all in God's hand. Let's see what God will. So, but his destiny was different. He didn't die like Anne Hutchinson. Actually, he left and he started a new colony called Rhode Island. And in the center was Providence. And this is where Williams created a new church called the Baptist Church. And the Baptist Church was different than Puritans. The Baptists were more of the freedom of religion, even for Jews and Catholics. So the Baptist Church says, we're not going to force anyone to go to our church. Of course, they would like it. They would talk to them to go to our church, but they're not going to make laws to regulate religious behavior. So the Baptists focus a lot about the free will of a person. If in the Baptist Church, it's going to be, we should respect their free will, right? No one should be forced. And also the Baptists respected the Native Americans. They said, we're not going to, have war with the Native Americans. We're not going to steal their land. We're going to ask them. The Baptists were going to respect the Catholics. Even though the Catholics were the minority, they're not going to force these Catholics to become Protestant. Okay. So this was different. And they also said everyone can vote. Everyone who has just property. If you own land here, if you live here, you own land here, then this is your place, then you have a right to vote. Of course, if you don't live here, you can't vote. Let's say if you're just a neighbor, you're going to vote, meaning like you're from Georgia and you're going to come all the way down. Of course, you shouldn't have a right to vote. It's not where you belong. But since you live here, you have a right to vote. Right. So Rhode Island was the place where Roger Williams created, and a lot of people who ran away from these strict Puritan rules ended up in Rhode Island. So Rhode Island was called a squatter colony. Basically it was called bad names from the Puritans. Okay. But eventually Rhode Island will get rights to become an official, legitimized colony in 1644. Parliament will approve it in England. Okay, you are legit now. New England also spreads out in this map. You can see Maine here, all these colonies are being formed mainly by Puritans and also some Baptists. And a lot of them they're founding it. For example, Hartford, Connecticut combined together, New Haven combined together. Reverend Thomas Hooker was the one that started the Hartford area. New Connecticut River Colony. Also, they formed some similar compact, but fundamental orders, which is like the Mayflower Compact again, a kind of democracy, meaning majority rules. So this is just a history of New Hampshire, and these people are starting colonies here. Okay. Okay. Now this is red. That's meant to be orange, so I hope you don't get confused when you're listening to this. Let me change that. Never mind. Okay, of course there were Puritans who still weren't happy, but in the beginning they had to deal with Wampanoag Indians, where Squanto was at, and Squanto helped translate things because he learned English because he was kidnapped by fishermen and then later learned English and came back. And he was a Wampanoag, but later he helped sign the Thanksgiving. So those were eventually what happened. But the Wampanoag had other Indians around them. Besides them, there was the Pequot, there was the Narragansett. So basically, as the Puritans expanded, they went to conflict, uh, and they had a fight with the Pequot. So the Narragansett were allies with the Puritans, and they joined together against the Pequot. So they had war. Okay. Um, Also, Massasoit's son, they called him King Philip. Massasoit, who's Massasoit again? He is the chief of the Wampanoag. Okay. Now, they were friends in the beginning. The chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag tribe were friends with the Puritans, but the son, Metcalm, also known as King Philip, didn't like that deal. They didn't like the Puritans. So this is why it changed. Eventually, Massasoit turned against the Puritans. So his father would probably be upset about this. and they had another war, and that's why it's called King Philip's War. So Massasoit's son Menachem is called King Philip. You might be confused. Oh, King Philip is a European. No, King Philip is a name that they just gave him to the Native American. Okay, seeds of colonial unity and independence. All right. So eventually the four colonies together would join. Now, who are the four colonies so far up in New England? You have Connecticut. Okay. Let me go back to this picture here. So you remember that there are these four colonies that are going to band together. You have Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was partnered up with Plymouth. Plymouth became under Massachusetts. So this is Massachusetts Bay Colony. That's one. Number two, you have Rhode Island. Number three, you have Connecticut. And number four, you have New Hampshire. Okay, New Hampshire was right in between here, these two. Actually, this one, Maine, you might wonder how come Maine wasn't here. Maine is actually called Massachusetts at that time. Okay, Maine is going to get its own name later in the future. So just don't be confused. It's really for Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. Those were the four colonies at that time in that area. Okay, these four would combine to be called the New England Confederation. Okay, they knew that they had to combine all together because the Native Americans and the French and the Dutch are growing, and they're enemies actually to the English, and they keep harassing them, attacking them in different sides here and there, little attacks. So, in order to help each other out, they combine their militaries, they form together. So, let me explain this combination. Massachusetts is the Bay Colony, and the Plymouth put together. New Haven, two Connecticut colonies, they also combine put together. Okay, so this term, the era benign neglect. Now, there was a lot of trouble in England, basically. There was a civil war in England. So, because England was focusing on its own matters, the colonies in America was able to be free from its control in a sense. Like they basically neglected them so they could do whatever they want, pretty much. And that's why it's called neglect. So they were able to kind of establish their own things here and there. Okay. Okay. Um, Charles II gave rival Connecticut in 1662 a C-to-C charter grant, so Connecticut becomes legitimized. A finally crushing blow fell on the stiff-necked Bay Colony in 1684 when its precarious charter was revoked by the London authorities. Okay, now what does this mean? These colonies had the freedom to do what they want, create their own laws, right? They were under Massachusetts Bay Colony, mainly the church government, Bay Commonwealth, making their own laws in their own way that they want. The king took that away. Says all together, you are no longer forming a law unto yourselves. This is going to be called the Dominion of New England. He combined from even including New York to East and West Jersey, all the way to Massachusetts. All of you are all together, the Dominion of New England. So he revoked their charter, meaning their contract, and he says, now you are under the king, under English king. So this is a big difference. And so new administration comes in, new law, especially the English navigation laws. Now these English and navigation laws are going to be a big deal. I'll explain that more later. And so there'll be a new kind of governor that's going to rule over all of you guys in New England in that part of America. Now, don't be confused when we're saying New England. Okay, we're not talking about the old England in Europe. The New England is Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, all those places. Okay, that's called New England. That's why when you see the team New England Patriots, they're referring to those northeastern states. Okay, so yes, Sir Edmund Andros comes in, new guy, take control of New England. He does so many things that he changes the town meetings, which the church days that they meet. He changes the titles. He cancels many things. He chooses his own people. He puts a new law, stricter laws on them. A lot of new people come in who are soldiers, who are like just bad people who are ruining this Puritan thing. Okay, and so this is what was going on. People were upset until something happened, the Glorious Revolution. So King James was the one that put Edmund Andros, but King James gets kicked out by his daughter in England. So King James is dethroned. The daughter gets married to a Protestant uh, of the Netherlands, and they both are coming to England, and so they both flee. So what happens if the boss is out of power? What happens if Sir Edmund Andros's boss is no longer in power? Now, that means Edmund Andros in New England has no power as well. And so he knows this, and all the Puritans are like, well, this guy's out of a job. Let's go get him. Sir Edmund Andros tries to run away, but he gets caught. He tries to run away in women's clothing, actually, but gets busted trying to escape. Anyway, they get to kick him out. Um, so it's what happens to this New England colony. It still becomes a colony, but under a new governor, has a new charter, but they still had the privilege of voting, and they still said all males will have own property will vote. Okay, So now that there was a new king and queen, now there was again a period of salutary neglect, which means that laws were weakly enforced, right? They were just not, they were getting away with a lot of things. Okay. So this is basically the history of the New England colonies. Up to here, we talked about it, and this is about how Puritans came in, and then the royal power took over. Then it came back again, back to the Puritans. But this time they still kept some democratic things, like all male can vote, not just church members. All male who's just property holders, for example. Okay, so now we're getting into the second half, the Old Netherlanders and New Netherlands. Now we're at the last part of the colonies, which is the middle. Actually, England didn't have the middle. The Netherlands people, the Dutch people of the Netherlands, were in the middle. So there's this era of the Rembrandt. Okay, so even the Dutch were growing powerful. They were going through a golden age as well. Okay, and just like they had a company, the Dutch East India Company was starting colonies there. They had explorers. They hired English people to explore the place, and they got the Delaware region, the New York Bay region. So there was Dutch people there. So these Dutch people were from the Netherlands, and what do you think they're going to call their colony that's in the middle? New Netherlands. Go figure, right? Very creative. You got New Spain in Mexico. You got New England, and you have the New Netherlands. So they just put new in all these colonies in North America. Okay, so the Dutch were planting all these things, and they buy Manhattan Island for basically pennies today. New York is so expensive, but they bought it for at that time just for pennies. And they're gonna call their capital of the New Netherlands New Amsterdam, because Amsterdam in Europe is their capital. They're gonna call it, this is the New Amsterdam. So they're just naming it after the Netherlands regions. And their main religion or church was the Dutch Reformed Church. Okay, kind of like Puritans. Okay, and they had patroonships. They also were these kind of like just the way that they organized their land. Every acre or set of acres, they would settle 50 people on them. So that's called a patroonship. Eventually, it's like a manor and a state. Okay, so there was going to be eventually some conflict, and there was also a region under the New Netherlands. The Swedish come in, and they're called New Sweden. New Sweden. New Sweden is on Delaware. As you know, it's going to become the state of Delaware later. But New Sweden was there, and basically, the New Netherlands, um, the, the New Netherlands are going to have war with the Swedish, and Peter Stuyvesant, who is the New Netherlands leader, governor, is going to have war with New Sweden, and now New Sweden is going to become under New Netherlands. Delaware is going to be under New Netherlands. So that's just basically what that means. So yes, you have all these New Sweden, New Netherlands, New England, and just know that New Sweden and New Netherlands takes over, so they just get a little bigger. Okay, now we all know that it's not going to be the Netherlands, right? It's going to end up becoming England. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is, yes, the English people get greedy. It's kind of weird how there's English territory and colonies in Virginia, and then there's English colonies in New England, but right in the middle is the Dutch people. Yes, they get greedy, and the English people send the military, and they take the middle, and now they change the name. Okay, here's the switch off from New Netherlands to England. So the king, Charles II, gives that middle area to his brother, who is the Duke of York. There's a place called York in England, and almost like the governor of York, he's gonna give that middle region in America to his brother, who's the governor of York, the Duke of York. So what do you think he's gonna call that region now? He's not gonna call it the New Netherlands anymore. He's gonna change the name. This is now the New York, right? Pretty obvious. The New York, and so the Dutch people lose power and the English people come in. Oh, however, there's some Dutch culture still there. For example, the name of the places in Harlem, Brooklyn, Hellgate, those are all former Dutch names. And some of the Dutch cultures were brought in. For example, Easter, that's a Dutch culture. That's where America got it, not from England. Santa Claus, that's a Dutch culture. Waffle, that's Dutch. Sauerkraut, bowling, sleighing, skating, golf or golf, those are all Dutch stuff. That was not created in America. Okay, and then we get another middle colony, Pennsylvania. Now, we have to know another Protestant religion, the Quakers. They actually called the Religious Society of Friends, that's what they call themselves, but of course, what's more famous is what other people call them, which were the Quakers. Okay, the Quakers were a different kind of belief. Of course, they were against Roman Catholic because they were under Protestants. Just know that the Protestants broke off, right, from the Catholic Church, and the Protestants, under their branch, created Puritans, created, Quakers, and so forth. So they had a lot of belief in freedom from religion, meaning like freedom from authority. So they didn't want to join military. They said that's against their religion. Okay, so William Penn was a Quaker. He didn't join the military, so he got in trouble. Now, people who don't join the military, they're called as saucy and impertinent, kind of cowards. They want to fight for the country, and they get in trouble for that. William Penn got a lot of money because his father had a lot of money, and the king owed the father money, and he buys this whole area. Well, not really buys it. The king gives it as payment because the king owes William Penn's father. So the king pays William Penn's father in land in America, and so he gets a lot of land. But William Penn is in charge of getting people into this place. So William Penn calls, well, he didn't call, the place is called Pennsylvania, the land of William Penn, right? Um, and he just has to get a lot of people to move in. So he gets a lot of all kinds of European immigrants moving in. Anybody who could work, masons, shoemakers, carpenters, all of them end up coming in. William Penn was very nice to the Native Americans. Like here, he even allows them to join their meetings and democratic meetings. Okay, so yes, again, this is the same thing. He's very nice. He allows the freedom of worship, even he allows guaranteed freedom of worship, and also to the Catholics and to the Jews. So he was very friendly to all. Um, there was also something called blue laws. Blue laws are like laws, religious laws, because it was very Protestants try to avoid being worldly or sinful, so they make it illegal to play playing cards, dice, games, and it is illegal to be excessively hilarious, like having so much fun, you're laughing so hard that would be illegal. You look like out of control. So that's what that place was all about. But in any case, they were generally happy people. They were also good in business, exporting grain. So grain was their main thing, bread, right? That's what grain is made out of. And that became a bread colony. And oats, like Quaker oats, because that's what they were making food, that kind of food. Okay, so and then there's this place called Jersey, right? And so that area was given to one there. Okay, there was a place in England called Jersey. In New Jersey, a New Jersey was created. Okay, and the Duke of York gave it to, again, one of his people. So now you have the New Jersey. So here it is. First, it was actually East Jersey, and then this is West Jersey, but that was New Sweden at that time. So remember the history that this was New Sweden, but New Netherlands took it, but England took it all. So in the middle, instead of calling it East and West Jersey, they called it all together the New Jersey. New Jersey. Just combine these two together, and then you have the Jersey. You have New York here, you have Pennsylvania here, you have Delaware here. One, two, three, four. Okay, 4 + 4 is 8, and then plus the 5 in the south. Okay, is going to be 13 colonies. Okay. All right, so Delaware was able to get its colony going too. They named it Delaware after Lord Delaware because the Quakers were thankful to him. Okay, so all in purple is just, again, I talked about the bread colony. They focus on this. Also lumbering and shipbuilding were the main economic things. Okay, so this is their way forming their economy. Okay, so those are all the 8 colonies of the North that we talked about. We talked about the 5 colonies in chapter 2. So I hope this helps you understand the history here of the 13 colonies.
All right, good morning. So let's just make this chapter 4 a quick one. This is actually not a long chapter. This deals with the lifestyle, kind of like culture of the people in this time from 1607 to 1692. So if you notice that these chapters are not necessarily always chronological, you can see how we're going back to 1607. That's because 1607 was how when Jamestown started, and we want to now talk about this side of U.S. history, which is their lifestyle, which is kind of like their cultures and the activities that they did as a community, as a people. So that's where we're at. So this is where we talk about the geography, the environment. We talk about their traditions. Okay, so let's first talk about the Chesapeake. So there is a place in Virginia called the Chesapeake Bay. That's where Jamestown language. So this is where Jamestown started, and this is where they landed. Now, the Chesapeake was actually a place where there was malaria, dysentery, typhoid. So it was really hard to survive, and there was mostly males. So a lot of the males were competing for the women. Hardly any children went on board in Virginia. So it's really just for workers. So in the beginning, there was, in terms of demographics, there was more men than women. So eventually, they had to kind of order more women. And if there was a woman who couldn't get married in London, then women who would arrive in Virginia or Maryland would definitely be married because of this kind of culture or demographic. And then the tobacco economy. So what was this like? So tobacco was their way of life. That was their money making profit. And tobacco exhausted the soil. Now, what this means is tobacco takes a lot of the nutrients from soil, and
farmers didn't rotate the crops, meaning once you exhaust all the nutrients from the soil, you have to give it a year or two or three, have animals graze over it, poo and over it, fertilize it. So the soil could be rich in nutrients again, and then you could replant tobacco. But they weren't doing that. They were just exhausting it, squeezing out all the nutrients from the soil because of their tobacco plantations, and then they stretch out to the next land and they buy it. So they were just basically killing land and not recultivating it. So that was a problem with this tobacco economy. And another problem was labor. So they got these contracted servants, also known as indentured servants. Indentured servants are people who would get their freedom dues. Basically, they would work for 7 years or 5 to 7 years. And then when they're finally done with their service to their masters or to the head, then they would receive barrels of corn, suits of clothes, and even a parcel of land. So these indentured servants were mostly poor white people coming from England, moving into the South. And every time there was somebody who paid for the passage of these indentured servants, a rich person, for example, they would be given this privilege under the head right system, who would receive 50 acres of land for every labor that they have paid for. So if you buy someone's plane ticket or ship ticket, then you would receive 50 acres in Virginia. So it was very tempting because you needed workers, and that was a way to bring workers in, is to get the people to pay for their tickets so they get more land, make it more alluring to stay in Virginia. So eventually, 100,000 indentured servants came to the region. In a sense, they were like white slaves, right? Okay, so actually, the indentured servants, this is red, it's a vocabulary term, and head right system is a vocabulary term as well. Okay, so all of these indentured servants, there were just so many poor people. Now, what happens when there's a lot of poor people who are free but don't have a job, cannot make a profit, and they're upset, and there's no women to marry, and they have guns? It is a rebellion about to happen. So you're about to see a Bacon's rebellion about to occur. So this is an event that happens in Virginia because of the poor. So what happened is this: there was the governor of Virginia, Governor William Berkeley, and in a sense, it was versus this 29-year-old planter, Nathaniel Bacon. That's why it's called Bacon's Rebellion. So what happens is there was a lot of the not plantation owners, but small farm planters who were kind of living in the frontier, living in the edge of the part of Virginia. And of course, in the edge, in the frontier, kind of near the boonies, you can see the Native Americans peeking in, looking through the jungle, and it was more scary to live in that area. You are probably more threatened because that's where the first place the Native Americans would steal your food, attack you. So if you're Nathaniel Bacon, you would depend on the governor, William Berkeley, to protect you, to send soldiers for you, to build walls, for example. But Berkeley refused to retaliate against the Indian attacks. Berkeley did not protect Bacon and other farmers. So what would Bacon just do? So Bacon was upset because actually Governor Berkeley made deals with the Native Americans, making money with them. So he didn't want to harm them or go against them. So Bacon formed the rebellion. A lot of them were the free men, the former indentured servants who had nothing to do, and joined with the protest. That's what people do, right? They use the people who have nothing to do and make them join in protest these days. And this led to this Bacon's rebellion, and Bacon ignited basically the capital of Jamestown. And of course, Governor William Berkeley escaped, went back to England for a while, and then eventually William Berkeley brought back troops to find Bacon and his followers. And then they found them, and then they hanged them, all those who rebelled against the governor. Now, all of this event is kind of like a lower class versus the high class, which you will see a lot in history. You're going to see a lot of these protests, a lot of these protests between low class people versus the high gentry. And this is just what this history is going to be repeatedly be about. Okay, you see here a slave trade picture. This is the slave trade attending the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is a very important vocabulary term. This should be read. This Middle Passage has this journey basically from Africa to America. All right, this voyage to the New World was like this. These slaves were chained together, and eventually you had 400,000 slaves coming into America, and these slaves couldn't get out for 3 or 4 months. Poo and pee was falling from first deck, second deck, right? So about 20% of them would die along the way, and they would just throw them off overboard, right? So because the indentured servants stopped coming because one, they weren't a permanent worker, and two, they had a rebellion, so they couldn't be trusted. So they instead hired this Royal African Company to bring in these slaves instead. So this is the beginning of the slave trade. Now, when you look at this chart here, we think America had the most slaves. Of course, it's bad. There shouldn't be slaves, period. But Brazil had the most slaves. 560,000 slaves were transported, okay, into Brazil. But at least in America, you know, 10,000 at that time. But when you think about the percentage, Brazil had brought in the most. 5% of them were in the United States. Of course, these are all just bad, but unfortunately, Brazil had it worse. So there was, even though America had a slave trade going on, these places, Spanish America and Portuguese, they did more harsh slavery than we did. Okay, so just a map of the slaves going in. Okay, so eventually the slaves will eventually outnumber even the plantation owners and the white population. So that's what was going on. And it was the Middle Passage. Again, like I said, 20% of them would die. Most of them came from the west coast of Africa. Okay. And where they arrived first, they would go to the Caribbean and some directly to Charleston, South Carolina, sometimes even Rhode Island. So that's where the slaves would end up in. And remember the Barbados Slave Code? The slave code was even brought along so that they could make sure that they are permanent property and they could do whatever they want with them. Unfortunately, they even use Christianity, the Bible, to abuse. They abuse the Bible, misuse it, so they could justify slavery. So they said the Bible says we could have slaves. They said Ham, the son of Noah, who was the ancestor of the Africans, because he did this to Noah, he was meant to be a slave, as it says here. So they even misinterpreted the Bible to justify slavery. Slavery might have begun in America for economic reasons, but by the end of the 17th century, it was clear that racial discrimination also powerfully molded the American slave system. Yes, because of the slave system, because of this idea that the African Americans are low and they should be treated as slaves, even though they're not today, but still because of that, it led to a lot of racial discrimination on their color, as you can see today. So this notion needs to be gotten rid of. We're all equal. It doesn't matter. People should be judged by their character, not by their skin color. Just because you're white or black, it doesn't mean anything. But based on your character, that's what will be judged. Okay, what about slave life? So of course, most of them worked in the agricultural farms, rice and tobacco. Tobacco was actually easier compared to rice. Rice had to bend down and work on that rice field, which was harder. Most women would work at the homes, inside the kitchens. Most men outside. Okay, but the Africans also brought in their culture, like the Gula, which is a combination of African languages of Angola and others, and they brought in words. They even brought in their dancing culture, the ring shout, and this is kind of like how music is in churches, and it kind of, moved into the modern music today. But in churches you have the ring shout, right? And this is what African Americans would do in their African cultural music. There's one singer, and then everyone repeats the singer's shouts. So just like in the church, when one guy goes "Amen," then everyone says "Amen." It's just this repeated shout. Okay, with all these slaves, don't you think that they would have rebelled eventually, or that they could have rebelled? Yeah, and they tried. New York City, 1712, South Carolina, the Stono River Rebellion, these two events. It just made the whites more angry and made them become more strict towards the slaves, more strict laws. So unfortunately, there was no successful slave rebellion that would overthrow slavery. Every time they tried, it would fail. Okay, so Southern society, there's this triangle and this social ladder. When you think of this triangle, you think of first class, second class, third class, kind of like that, top, middle, and bottom. On the top of the social ladder were the really rich plantation owners. Actually, there's only a very few of them. Famous names like Fitz's, the Lees, the Washingtons. A lot of these guys even made up the House of Burgesses, and they were the ones deciding the big decisions in politics. Sometimes they were also called the first families of Virginia. This is a vocabulary term, FFBs. Okay. So they had to do a lot of work also with plantation management. And then beneath these first families of Virginia, the top class, were the small farmers who would have like 2 or 3 slaves, 1 slave even, to work their farms. They didn't have big acres, just small ones. Okay. And then below them were the indentured servants, who used to be one, former indentured servants, and now they just have the lowest paid job. Then, of course, in the bottom, and the big bottom, were the African American slaves. Okay. Also, within the social class, there was a new class emerging. This was the urban professional class, which is the lawyers and financiers. There's a new kind of rich class coming into this class system in the South. Okay, so that was like the social construct of the South. And now we're going to talk about the North, especially New England. Now, New England was different. New England had clean water, cool temperatures that slowed the spread of killer microbes. And so diseases were not as prevalent. And also, they lived longer, 10 years longer than they did in England. They were really, in a way, blessed by their religion and their faith, because when they left England, they lived longer. When they moved to Massachusetts, they lived longer. They lived a long age like us. 70 years is pretty long at that time. So New England people tended to migrate. Also, not like by men only; they a whole family, even the children would come in. So that would help with all kinds of chores at the house and different labors that the wife could do, the child could do. So the population was producing so much because of the way their social construct was organized. Okay. And women were always getting pregnant. I mean, there was a lot of babies being born. Now you might think like, why isn't that like too expensive? Today, yeah, today it is. But then having a lot of children was necessary at that time because the children could help with the farming. All the children helped the women to accomplish more duties. So it became more productive. Of course, the women had a lot of hard work to do, but when you have more kids, when you think about it, the kids help with the hard work. The kids could help with the mother's chores. So actually, having more kids, I mean, in the beginning, it's hard, right, when they're babies. But when they become like teenagers, when they become, imagine if you had like 10 teenagers in the house, then that's a lot of chores that could be done. Actually, they could even sell more farm produce, sell more lettuce and carrots and wheat to more customers because you have kind of like a whole farmer team. So having children would be eventually a blessing. Okay, so it would always be married women would experience up to 10 pregnancies a lifetime. And child raising was the full time job, but in the end, the women have big responsibility to teach them good habits and all these things. Okay, but New England women usually give up their property rights once they got married. So if they even had property or was given property from their parents or their father, it still would be given to the husband. Okay, a woman would always submit or be subjection to the husband, and that is a what they believed in biblically. That women it's better to have one order, and the men would be the ones to kind of be the head of the household, and the wife would submit. Okay, meaning that not try to charge things around. I'll be the man, even though the man is hardly around anyway because he's always outside. So if the men are outside, is always known to submit to. But in any case, it doesn't mean that the women are meant to be like this. You know, even Puritans knew that the men had also a role here. It's not mentioned, but in the Bible, the Puritans believe that okay, while the wife submits, but the husband must love the wife. So you know, and what kind of love? So much the husband should love the wife enough to die for her. That's what it says. That's what Puritans believe in. So it's fair, right? The husbands will always love the wife, so that's why they cannot ever mistreat the wife, even though the wife is subject under him. So it works both ways. Okay, and even if there was a time when a husband could be, let's say, abusive or even mean to the wife, because it was a church community, the pastors would come in and offer counseling and intervene. So there's always a pastor in the church who would always be ready to maintain order. You know, today there's no one who comes in, right? When mom and dad fight, grandpa or grandma comes in. If they live in the house, I don't know, but usually it just goes on and on. But with the Puritan church, there was always an elder, a pastor ready to intervene whenever a couple would have trouble. So this was also a benefit why there was almost no divorces at all because they really had the pastor to guide them, to keep them together. Hardly any adultery. And even if you wanted to commit adultery or even look at a woman, whatever, to lust for her, you would wear a letter A around your neck, and that's so humiliating. So they hardly would commit adultery. Okay, so how would these New England towns be set up? So it was a tightly knit society, um, and they had kind of like a setup in their town. They had the town father who would be the ones paying for the town, the whole village in a sense, buying all the land. They would set up a meeting house, which is the church and the place for political decisions. They'd also have that would be where a town hall would be. That's where you make the political votes. And it'll be surrounded by houses. A village green would be for the military so they can practice. They would have a wood lot so they could gather wood for fuel, you know, like in the chimney or for cooking. They would have a tract for growing crops, like a little farmland. And they would have another land for the animals. And also, almost all the children would be educated. If there was at least 50 families in one area, they had to have an elementary school where they start to teach the kids how to read and write. So there's at least 50 kids in a sense. Then you would need to build a school. Okay. So eventually they had a college, and that became today's Harvard. Massachusetts is the founder of the Harvard College. Harvard College, they weren't training like math or science or whatever. The college was a seminary to train pastors. That's what almost all the Ivy League colleges today in the beginning were just to preachers to preach, and it'll be an adult male. Okay. Okay. So now we have this event called the Halfway Covenant and the Salem witch trials. Yes, there was this witchcraft, witch hunt. They really believed in witches at that time in Massachusetts, specifically a town in Massachusetts called Salem. Okay, so we have to see what was going on here, the background of this. First, there is this problem. There was a decline in conversions in the church. Now, remember, to convert, you have to preach to them and they have to believe and be converted at the moment of their belief. So, but there was low conversions, right? And so they wanted to convert the children in a fast way because they can't be part of the church unless they're converted. But children are not easy to convert because if you're kids, it's hard to tell they really believe. Of course, they could easily believe, but how can we have a shortcut to get them to the church? This was called the halfway covenant. This is a vocabulary term. Halfway covenant kind of means if they halfway believed, or if they half do something, and that is just if they just get baptized, then they're halfway there. They should at least be a church member. They don't need to believe; they just have to be baptized. So because they kind of like compromise with this, then you got a lot of these children who grew up not really believing in the Bible, not really believing in what the Puritans believed in. They were just there in the church. There was no conversion for these kids growing up. So these kids would eventually become problems. Now, what I mean is a lot of these kids who grew up to become witches. They didn't like the Bible. They were forced to go to church. They were rebellious. When parents forced the kids to go to church, the more they didn't want to go. So they found out that some of the teenage women were accusing women of being witches. So there's these teenage girls saying that woman's a witch, that woman's a witch, blah blah blah. And then how could these accused women defend themselves when there's these girls testifying that she's a witch? How can you prove you're not a witch when these girls are saying that they saw you, whatever? So unfortunately, some of these falsely accused women were hanged for witchcraft, although they weren't witches. So eventually, they had all these trials, and it was very difficult because how can you testify? Of like, who's your witness? So, but eventually, it got carried out. It got carried away because the girls started to accuse the judge and the judge's wife for being a witch, and then they knew that okay, this is just too far. They're just making things up. So there was a witch hunt, which became actually a metaphor today for communist hunt and all those things. But yeah, there was witchcraft in America at this time. Okay, the New England way of life. So New England people are known for backbending, toil, put a premium on industry, and penny pinching frugality, meaning they work very hard, they save a lot of money, and they make use of anything to make a profit. Even called the nutmeg state. You guys don't know what nutmeg is? It's actually, no one knew that within these nuts, you can actually make an ingredient for bread. So you have nutmeg pie or whatever, and they realized, wow, they really looked at every single acorn in the trees to see if it's edible, which shows like they were just working really hard to make a lot of money, and it worked out. They made a lot of money, and it's not easy to farm in New England. It was a lot rocky, but they still like did whatever they could to farm. They made more money than they could probably in Virginia. So they were very, very hardworking. They didn't want to waste the earth. They wanted to improve it. They brought pigs, horses, cattle, and they were good at building ships and using the ships for trading along the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. They even caught a lot of fish. There's so much fish in Boston, so they sold a lot of fish and made money with the fishes around there. So they were very resourceful, self-reliant. The people in Virginia, they didn't fish, even though there was fish in the coast. They didn't think about fishing, but the people in New England, they thought about fishing. So they were really trying to make a lot of money. Okay, the early settlers' days and ways. They planted in the spring, tended their crops in the summer, harvested in the fall, and prepared in the winter to begin the cycle anew. So this is what their routine was. And they wouldn't waste even the candle. They would do as much chores and try to save the candle. And that's a sign of someone's really trying to save every single thing, not even waste the candle. You know how a candle can be wasted? They wouldn't save the wax on that. Women, stay for free, planted. Men, cleared the land, fenced, planted, and cropped it. Children, helped with all the tasks. Okay. So this was the social structure. Okay. There wasn't really much of an aristocracy like in the South where like high class gentry. No, it was pretty much almost everyone was almost the same class of people. All right. So that's it for this section. It's kind of short, but still important in U.S. history.
So this is chapter 5, entitled Colonial Society on the Eve of Revolution. Colonial Society on the Eve of Revolution. So 1700 to 1775, if you notice, this is like a sequel to the previous one because the American life was 1607 to about 1700, and now we're at the next 75 years after that. How was their society like? What kinds of people moved in besides them, their religion, things that were taking shape among them as a people, as a united culture. So conquest by the cradle. So first we can see that it was really the population that really started to just go kaboom. It just grew so much. 2.5 million people inhabited the 13 colonies. So this is big compared to the other colonies around them. Okay, 400,000 of them were white immigrants. 500,000 were African Americans. They were black. Also, the average age was 16, so there was a lot of young people who were being born here. The city started to become very populated, especially Virginia, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Maryland.
New York, Boston, Charleston, these places became very, very populated. It was really a mingling of races. All kinds of European nations were coming in and forming what would eventually become an American nation, right? It's just a set of multicultural nations from Europe coming in. Germans were one of the biggest immigration, made up 6% of the population. A lot of them stayed in Pennsylvania. Their religion was primarily Lutheran. And then the Scots Irish came in. Now, what kind of Irish or what kind of Scottish people are these are the Scottish people who were living in Ireland, and they made up 7%. Now, the main difference between these Scottish people and regular Scottish people is that they put Irish there because these are Scottish people who were living in Ireland, and these are the Scots who were being persecuted because of their different religion. They were Scottish Presbyterians, and so they were being persecuted. So again, with the religious purpose, they moved into America. So you got those two kinds of big immigrants, the Germans and the Scots Irish moving in. Scots Irish were forming the Presbyterian Church. Okay, so Scots Irish people tend to live at the Allegheny Barrier. Allegheny means the Appalachian Mountains, right at the foot of the Appalachian Mountains. And you would think that they would live near the coast, near the ports, where they could, be near cities and make money. But the Scots Irish were tougher than that in a way. They would live deep in the forest in this way and start farming there. So they were kind of hardworking as well. Because they live at the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, they created this great wagon road. Okay, and this great wagon road was a road that's going to eventually develop to become one of the main roads today in Eastern America. The Scots were known for making whiskey. That's why you have a drink called Scotch. And there were also the Scottish people had a habit to rebel, to protest. So when they felt like their rights were being taken away or there was no justice from the government, they would go to the government and protest and complain. And there was a movement called the Regulator Movement that happened in North Carolina. It was an insurrection. So just like that, the Scottish people were also kind of like the rebellion in that time, starting rebellions. Of course, besides just the Germans and the Scots Irish, there were also other immigrants who came in who maybe it wasn't as big. So 5% altogether. The other 5% were the French Huguenots, the Welsh, the Dutch, the Swedes, the Jews, the Irish, the Swiss, and the Scots Highlanders. The Scots Highlanders are different than the Scots Irish because the Scots Highlanders are like the gentry, the high class Scots. Okay, and the Scots Irish and the Scots Highlanders wanted to differentiate between them, like low class Scots Irish and high class Scots Highlanders. So that's how they felt they were to be called. But in essence, mostly everyone was Anglo-Saxon dominantly. Of course, the other 20% were other European, other races, but mostly they were Anglo-Saxon, meaning from England. Okay, the middle colonies, especially Pennsylvania, had most of the immigrants coming in and living there in that group. But all of these immigrants, they intermingled together. And so because of this intermingle, you have a man named Michel Guillaume de Courbevoie, this French guy. He goes into America and he says, what is this strange country? What kind of race is this? This is an American. So back then, usually in Europe, people marry their own race, right? English marry English, French marry French, Scots Irish marry Scots Irish, but not in America. There's a lot of mixing going on. And so this is where America would have all these mixed races. So they gave this attribute, a cultural attribute called American. Okay, what was the structure of colonial society? Of course, there was still this social ladder, and in the bottom was obviously the slaves. But a lot in the middle, though, a lot of people were pretty much your regular middle class people. There were skilled artisans, people who were making products, manufacturing them with their own hands. There were a lot of shopkeepers and tradespeople. But what was different about American culture or American society was this openness in the social ladder, meaning that if someone wanted to move up from low class to middle class and middle class to high class, it was very possible in America. Unlike in Europe, you were born rich and you were born poor, and it was very difficult to become middle or high class. People were usually stationary. Once you're born into a rich family, born into a high class family, you would remain high class your whole life. But in America, it wasn't like that. It was very possible to elevate yourself up this social ladder. So that was a unique point of America. That's what made American society so significant compared to others. Also, what's so significant is this gods of war. First, there were these armed conflicts that happened a lot in other places, and they went to America to buy weapons from the Americans who were making these weapons. So they created a new class. That was so significant about it because if you were like a military supplier, you would make a lot of money. So it did create another high class. Okay. Yet, even though there was high class, there was still some poor people in these places. There was 10% rich people, but then there was a lot of people who were either average but mostly poor. And a lot of them had to be, once all the land was taken up, Now, in order to live prosperously, you got to have land, right? Because you could farm and you can sell, you could survive. But what if all the land is taken up? Then you would have to work for someone else. You would have to be employed by someone else who owns the farm and would pay you. You call that a wage laborer. And so this is the beginning of wage labor as well. And if you were poor and homeless, you would wear a letter P on your clothing. So they knew who they would give money to. All right. So mostly the wealth was concentrated in the hands of the largest plantation owners. So this is the South. So the South, though, there was a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. There was a lot of poor white people in the South and a very few rich people. So there was this gap, right? And then the former indentured servants were growing, and more white people were coming in because actually they dumped a lot of these felons or people who are robbers, rapists, and murderers, as you can see here. These guys would be dumped in America, and they're called jailbirds. So I guess the unwanted people in England or wherever, they dumped them in America. Okay, they deported them there, but some of them actually grew up and became successful. Of course, there was the lowest in the ladder, the African slaves. So even lower than the jailbird is the black slaves. They had no equality with the whites, and they couldn't even dream of going up this social ladder to become middle class or high class. So this was a struggle for them, as we all know. And did they try to? They knew that there was a lot of African slaves coming in, and they tried to stop importing them. Not stop slavery, but limit the population of the African Americans, the slaves coming in. But then they didn't stop it because it was a good business. So they continually vetoed the law to stop the slavery. So they just kept coming in or stop importing them. Okay, another interesting honored profession was the Christian ministry, meaning those who were pastors or a part of the clergy or preachers, they had there was an aspiring noble office to take. So people would go to college to become a preacher. But also there was also young doctors. But these doctors was the medical profession wasn't so developed yet. So they were still testing things, for example, finding out how to solve flus and sickness, and they felt like you just have to take out the blood. But obviously, if you take out too much blood, you can kill the person. They had some successful ways of testing some things, like the smallpox, for example. They were able to figure out how the smallpox works, or the chickenpox. Like you had to have a blood, right, that already developed the antibody from someone who already was infected. So if you don't know, when you get infected with something, your body tries to create antibodies to fight against the infection. But if you could transfer that blood to another person, then wouldn't that person have kind of like an immunity? So that's what they were doing. They're basically getting blood from someone who was infected with smallpox, who survived, and giving it to a healthy person. And then when they would get it, their body is ready. Okay. So there was a lot of people who were aspiring doctors who were still working and trying to understand that profession. And then there were lawyers. Now, lawyers were not as noble as we think they are, but back then they were actually like, people didn't like lawyers. It was unfavorable because they would even be known as troublemakers, and they would find them in these brothels or whatever. So these lawyers, not many people aspired to be a lawyer back in that time. But even though lawyers paid good money. Okay, what was a typical workday in America as we see here? So tobacco was to be the most stable crop. Okay, it was tobacco. And that was in the South. The bread colonies was in the middle colonies. So the bread colonies, grain and flour, this was going to be it's just bread, but it was significant because the bread colonies helped increase the standard of living in America. And it was better than other places in Europe. So there was so much food to sell and make. So they became very rich. There was a lot of fishing and whaling in New England, especially. Now, whaling is used for the oil from the whales. So, for their kerosene lamps. The fishing, there's a lot of fishing and shipbuilding. There was a lot of commerce where ships would help these businesses trade, and they would take their goods and ship them to England or wherever. You call these, this is the mariners who would be trading. And of course, there is this triangular trade where a triangular system was developed from America to Europe, and Europe to Africa, and Africa back to America, and that's triangle trade. And what kind of goods were being transported was slaves, also rum, which is alcohol, and gold. So this is like a new triangle that was developed. All right. Yes, of course, there was also the kind of rum was called Kill Devil. Even beavers was a big part of the trade. As you can see in purple, that is for the economy. That's the highlight there. And the women were, of course, spinning and weaving and making clothes. So this is it wasn't such a it was a manufacturing country at that time. That's where all the money was coming from. It wasn't like because there were bankers or something like that, like in England. No, they were just mainly manufacturing. And America had a lot of strong lumber. So lumber was a big part, but what's significant is that there was 1/3 of American lumber built the British Navy, and the British Navy was huge, and 33% of the ships were made from America. Okay, so America had a lot of resources to build ships to help make England actually more powerful, Britain powerful. Okay, now what would happen if America manufactured so much goods that Britain didn't need them? So if they have a surplus of goods, that meant that they had to sell it to someone else. They had to sell it to France. But if they sell it to France, if the Americans sell it to France, that's the British enemy. So because of this, they didn't want them to support their enemies or trade with them, even though they have all of these leftover goods. So they would have to pass, for example, the Molasses Act, so that it could prevent them from trading. Okay, um, Parliament passed the Molasses Act aimed at squelching North American trade with the French West Indies, because if you trade with another country, you have to pay a higher tax. But instead, people still were smuggling. This is significant because they started to smuggle, and eventually this would lead to the separation of Britain and America, and they didn't want to be united with them. Here we got a history of the horsepower and sail power. This is like the history of transportation, right? So all of it was dirt road in America, and there was no cars, obviously, and they used coach drivers, coach travelers, like a stagecoach, where you have a horse pulling a carriage. That was their thing, and it's very difficult to use that to travel far distances. We're not talking about moving 2 or 3 miles like in Guam. They're moving from Philadelphia to New York, Pennsylvania to Charleston. These took 2, 3, sometimes 29 days to travel from one city to another. It's not like, so where would you sleep? That's why they had a lot of taverns where people could sleep while they travel. So a lot of taverns sprang up on the main routes of the travel. Now, what was scary is that it's really traveling that far is actually pretty dangerous. What if your horse runs away? What if a tree falls down in the middle of the road? Who's going to move the tree? Who's going to maintain the road? So that's why whenever they would travel, they would always say Godspeed, like God bless your travel. May God speed you in your travel, that nothing bad happens. So this is this kind of culture of travel, a lot of taverns. And then, in these taverns, it's like these bars, right? A lot of talk, political talk, a lot of things that people are doing immorally. Yes. And there was also this postal system that they would, in this traveling roads, they would use these roads to pass on information. Okay, so here we have denominations. So America is a Protestant country, but among all the Protestant religions, what was the most? Top, Congregationalists. The Congregationalists are the Puritans. You can see they made up 500,000. And then the Anglicans are the Church of England, another 500,000. So that's the next Protestant branch. And then the Presbyterians, 410,000. Then the Dutch, the Lutheran, remember the Germans brought theirs in. The Dutch Reformed, 75. Quakers, 40. Baptists, 25. And then we have the Roman Catholics, also 25,000. So they were also a minority. Compared to 500,000, there's only 25,000 Catholics. The Jews were the least, 2,000. So these were the fewer religions, but all of these mainly Protestant, mainly Protestant. Mainly Protestant nations, maybe like 3% Catholic, 1% Jew, or something like that. So, okay, what were the big churches? It's really the Anglican Church and the Congregational Church, which is the Puritan Church. So most of the Anglicans were in the South, Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, and New York. And they had more of their main colleges in William and Mary in Virginia. William and Mary College, very famous Ivy League college today. But that's in that time, they used that to train preachers, the clergy. And then what about the Congregational Church, the Puritan Church? Okay, the Puritan Church also kind of related to Presbyterianism. They were also big on it too. They were related to the Presbyterians because of the same theology. Okay, but the one thing they had in common is they were always against the authority of a king. Right? They didn't like that. They said God is our boss, the main person in charge, the authority, not the king. So Anglicans in the New World were seriously handicapped by not having a resident bishop. So and the Anglicans have like their main bishop as well, but they had to be trained in England. They couldn't be trained in America. So because of this, there was a disconnect, meaning that the Anglican couldn't really control America. So there was a lot of freedom away from that. Okay, religious toleration. Roman Catholics were the ones that was discriminated against in America. If you were a Roman Catholic in America at this time, you would be discriminated against because Catholics was a Spanish kind of thing, a European kind of thing. They were the enemy of England. So there weren't even much Catholics in England to begin with. So if you were a Catholic in America, it was even worse. That's why they had to create a place where Catholics could not be persecuted. The Puritan, okay, so there was this great awakening. Okay, there was a time in America where there was a huge revival of the religious people, especially the Puritans. Now, what happened was there was a decreasing number of church people. right? People were now, they stopped going to church. It was descending. Okay. How can we awaken them up spiritually? And that was because of a theology called Calvinism. Remember, Calvinism in that time was about the elect. 100 years later, it kind of got people more confused, or they got them like bored, because Calvinism was so strict. To be converted was so strict, it was hard to tell, because it was hard for people to be perfect in front of them. So another theology called Arminianism came in, preached by, or developed by Jacob Arminius, that God doesn't only elect people, doesn't only choose things, that it's beyond people's control. No, there is also the free will. Now they preach about free will, that man must choose to be saved. Man had to make a choice. God will not force someone to convert. God will not force someone to go to hell. God will not force someone to be saved. God will respect their free will. If they don't want to go to heaven, that's their choice, even though God offered it. But if they choose not to, that is their fault. That is not God's fault. God made it available. God gave them 90 years to live, and yet they rejected it. Then they chose their destination. So with this free will, it motivated people to preach more, to encourage them to be willing to believe, instead of just waiting for God to choose them, or thinking that God didn't choose them. So this is a very new, different theology that came into the preaching. This is a little bit of liberalism. Okay, so it created this great awakening. Jonathan Edwards was very famous for this. So Edwards proclaimed with burning righteousness the folly of believing in salvation through good works, and affirmed the need for complete dependence on God's grace. So what was this message that woke people up, that Jonathan Edwards was preaching, this great awakening? He was emphasizing that you cannot receive salvation, or you cannot be saved from hell through good works. You cannot go to heaven through good works. You need to depend on God's grace. Now, what does it mean, depending on God's grace? This is simply depending on Jesus Christ's grace, his love on the cross. He does it for free. He takes you to heaven for free. He takes the punishment instead of you. He substitutes his life instead of you. So this is what Jonathan Edwards was preaching. But he was more preaching on hell. Like, hell is very real. Hell is where people go. If you are not converted or saved, people do go there. Okay, so people were very afraid. Because of Jonathan Edwards' style of preaching about the condemnation of hell, people were choosing to be saved, willing to be saved. Another guy is George Whitefield. George Whitefield was also a great preacher. He had a good way of speaking. He would even act out Satan's voice or something, and act out God's voice or whatever. And so it was very entertaining. But many people came. Even Benjamin Franklin came to his sermons to listen. So there was all of these revivals going out, and it was really like changing the old style of preaching in exchange for the new style of preaching. So you have the old light, where you have the old clergymen who were very skeptical about using so much emotion and theatrical. So people back then felt that using so much emotion is kind of fake. Like kind of like you don't really mean what you're saying. You're just kind of entertaining them. So they avoided emotion. But then now they said we should put emotion, more compassion, more theatrics into it. So these guys were called the new lights. So you have to understand, at this time, when they preached, they didn't try to get too loud. They didn't try to be too amen, amen. They were very just plain and straightforward to the point. They didn't want to do any tricks to kind of they felt like it was like a psychological trick if you try to be too emotional about it. But now they realize emotion can be used when there is preaching. Okay. So, but there are people who still were divided how much it should be used, or if not used at all. There should be Baptists and other sects more prepared to make room for emotion in religion. So should we have emotion in the preaching? Should we not have emotion? Should we just say it as it is? Okay. They also preached to the Native Americans and the Indians. David Brainerd was one famous preacher, and they preached, and they also built these seminaries and universities for them. Schools and colleges. Okay, so what was the purpose of these schools and colleges? Mainly for the Bible, to train preachers, to educate them so that they can become pastors and they could preach in their churches. That was why Harvard was established. All of these universities were, in the beginning, all important Ivy League colleges. For example, Harvard. That's a denomination of the Congregationalists. That's where they preached. That's where they trained their pastors in the beginning. Of course, Harvard today is very famous as a secular university. But back then, it was only for preachers to be trained. William and Mary, Anglican. Yale, Congregational. Princeton, Presbyterian. Pennsylvania, non-sectarian. Columbia, Anglican. Brown's University, Baptist. Rutgers University, Dutch Reformed. Dartmouth College, Congregational. As you notice, there's no Catholic university yet. It will take a long time because it's a Protestant nation. But these were where they trained the preachers. Okay. Now, what is American art? There wasn't American art and culture yet. Actually, they all just borrowed European art and culture. So here in blue, if you listen, you can put all these as one term. These are just, and just put them as artists and what they did. Okay. Architecture, again, they just borrowed it from the world. There was from the old world. There's also colonial literature. So what did any famous books that they got? Well, there was a famous poet called Phillis Wheatley. Benjamin Franklin, he was famous for writing the Poor Richard's Almanac. Okay, it was more read, but of course the Bible was the most read, and then after that was his almanac. What about this? What is this? Okay, some signs that they had here. You can read that. Pioneer Press. So there were a lot of printing. Now, Americans didn't really have a lot of books, but they had a lot of newspapers to read because they had a printing press and they printed pamphlets, leaflets, and journals. And there's a lot of things to read in there that was almost like reading a book. Okay. Now, newspapers were very powerful, right? Because you can post things that could get people to oppose the government or the British government, for example. So whatever you write there, you get people to move people big time. And there was one case that happened. A newspaper printer in New York named John Peter Zenger, he wrote about the corruption of the governor. The corruption of the governor. Can someone write something bad about a leader? Back then, it was illegal. You couldn't really write something bad against the leader. You go to jail. Actually, the governor could be like, hey, you write about me, that's libel, I charge you go to jail. But then this idea came up, okay? This idea is about if we don't print out the facts, then we are taking out the freedom of something. And that was Andrew Hamilton, okay? Andrew Hamilton, don't be confused with Alexander Hamilton, that's different. Andrew Hamilton, a lawyer, said that the very liberty of both exposing and opposing arbitrary power was at stake. Okay. Now, you would think that the governor would win, but in fact, the newspaper won in this trial, in this court case. The Zenger decision was a banner achievement for freedom of the press and the health of democracy. This is why this case is so significant. It's because when they tried to prosecute the newspaper, then the guy came out innocent. And they came out with this idea that, hey, freedom of the press. The press has the right to publish criticisms as long as it's responsible and true. Then they could publish criticisms against any leader or governor, even the king. And so this is like now the press cannot be stopped. They could publish all of these things now. So that was significant. Okay, the politics. Now, what kind of governments did they have? This is a little bit confusing. So okay, listen very closely. There are 13 colonies, remember? Now, generally, there was two branches of government. Governors, right? There's always this governor or their own leader, right? This is the left-hand side. And then on the right hand, there's the legislatures. Okay, it's not three branches, it's two branches. You have that one leader, like a governor, and then you have the legislature, like where all the senators are at. Each state or each colony had that kind of way. So 8 of the colonies had royal governors appointed by the king. What about the other 5? Do they have governors? Not necessarily. There was the landowners who chose the governors. So there's governors, yeah, but they were chosen by the people or by the landowners. So there's 8 governors chosen by the king, and the other, like in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were chosen by the people. Connecticut and Rhode Island, they elected their own governors, okay, in their own way, in their own people. So they had governors in their own way by either the king choosing them or by the landowners. Then there was also the other half of the government, which was the legislature, okay, the 2-house legislative body. Now, the upper house and lower house, they had that. The upper house was appointed by the crown or the royal government in whatever England, kind of like the senators. And the lower house was appointed by the people or those who own property. So they had this legislative branch too. Okay. So this is how they organized themselves politically. So of course, the governor would enact the law, execute the law. The legislature would create the law, make laws, and pass laws. Self-taxation through representation was a precious privilege that Americans had come to cherish above most others. But the authority to tax, who decided that? Was that the government or was that the people? The people could decide on the tax. This is going to be a big deal later. This is important. This is significant because they're going to complain that they cannot, they're not being represented fairly later, that they're deciding on these taxes without the people's consent. Okay, so that's why they're going to chant taxation without representation soon. The governors appointed by the king were generally able men, sometimes outstanding figures, but sometimes these guys were incompetent to lead in America. These are bad governors sometimes. They were chosen by the king. The colonial assemblies found various ways to assert their authorities and independence. Can the people control the governor? Yeah, there was one trick. You could withhold the governor's salary. So in a sense, the governor could not have full absolute control, they could hold back the salary to get the governor to make sure that they don't abuse their power. Okay. Okay, so what about what are these things here? What kind of administration? There was county government in the South ruled by the plantation owners. The town meeting style was in New England, and a hybrid or a mixture of the two was in the middle colonies. That's where the style of government was. Um, what about the right to vote? Actually, only those who own property had the right to vote. Not like if you're over 18, you can vote. No, only those who own property, and not everyone owned property. Actually, maybe 10%, 50%, 20% owned property. It wasn't big. So the right to vote, they give that to everyone. The right to vote was very powerful, but what if people voted for the wrong thing? Like, what if some uneducated person voted for the wrong person and the wrong idea, and that became the majority? So that's why the vote was very sensitive to give out. However, in all, America was more democratic than England was. England was not democratic. It was more obviously a monarchy. King decides everything for the most part. So that was very powerful. But America, yeah, people were given a lot of democracy and freer ideals, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble. So that had more democracy practice in America. So in this last section here, is talking about colonial folkways. What was the everyday life like? There was a lot of food, a lot of meat. Okay, they had a lot of amusement, a lot of winter sports. There were some things that people did in America that were, not completely boring. There were some things that were a little bit fun: house raising, quilting bees, husking bees, apple pairings, funerals and weddings, or like an opportunity for their social gatherings. Okay, they had winter sports: card playing, horse riding, cockfighting, or chicken fighting. Yeah, even in Guam. Lotteries, they would gamble. So America was like the other European places. Had they didn't have much holidays. Christmas wasn't celebrated. Christmas, Protestants did not celebrate Christmas at this time. Christmas is a Catholic invention. Christmas just comes in later, like worldwide, because of Santa Claus and the Christmas tree. But in history, Christmas was a Catholic invention, and the Puritans were against that because there was no Puritans were strict Bible believers. There was no date where Jesus was born on December 25th. Actually, there's dates saying Jesus was born not on winter because the shepherds were outside, so they would never bring their sheep during winter. Remember how the angel said to the shepherds, "Jesus is born." So where did that date come out of? Actually, the Catholics borrowed that from the Roman religion of the idols. So the Puritans knew that idea of Christmas was not biblical, but that was actually from the false gods that the Romans used to believe, and they just said, you know what, this is going to be Jesus' birthday, even though it was the sun god's birthday, sun, like the sun and the moon. The Romans used to believe in the sun, and December 25th is where they celebrated the false god. They just switched it to Jesus' birthday, and the Puritans were against that. That's why it says here Christmas was frowned upon, and now you know why. If you don't know your history, you can know it now. Of course, we all like Christmas because of the gifts, but we didn't know it was all about that. All were basically English language customs and Protestant in religion. So we have to know that in America, it was Protestant by religion, right? We get confused thinking that Protestants and Catholics are the same or whatever. No, you have to know clearly what exactly it is, how they practiced it. It was very different. You have to know clearly how it was different socially, that America was more fluid, going to higher class from low class. Unlike in Europe, it's not like that. They stuck to that one class for a long time, almost their entire life. If you're lucky, you could be born into a rich family and you're permanently there. If you're unlucky, you can be born into a poor family and you're also permanently there. That's like the medieval style in Europe. But in America, the up and down was good, except for the African Americans who were slaves. Okay, so this is chapter 5, right? I hope you guys could understand this and take in and study it.